Chapter 962. When Miranda Kerr heard Carter Moan's words, she was confused. She knew about Air Force One, but she didn't know about Marine One. In addition to the famous Air Force One, there was also an exclusive helicopter formation that served as the mission of the federal president. This helicopter formation had two models of political helicopters, the VH-3D modified from the Sea King SH-3D and the VH-60N modified from the Black Hawk UH-60A. Eric's two private airports in Ventura, north of Los Angeles, and Long Island, New York had begun construction. The two planned Boeing 747-400 and two other Gulfstream V business jets had also been ordered. Considering that the distance from the Point Manor to the Ventura airport was more than 40 kilometers, Eric purchased two more helicopters. This way, it would be more convenient for him to travel between the Ventura airport and the Point Manor in Malibu or downtown Los Angeles. The Point Manor originally had a Bell civilian helicopter company. However, Eric didn't dare to compliment the safety of civilian helicopters. Of the two political helicopters, the VH-3D was produced in 1976 and was very old. Naturally, he didn't consider it. Eric directly ordered two helicopters with the configuration of the VH-60N from Sikorsky Aircraft Company. Of course, some of the classified electromagnetic pulse protection systems couldn't be installed. Eric wasn't interested in these. He always believed that once a nuclear war broke out, human civilization was destined to be destroyed. The so-called nuclear protection system was just a self-consolation. In addition, the federal government didn't actually prohibit civilians from buying military helicopters. The military even often auctioned military aircraft that were on the verge of obsolescence at low prices to people who liked to collect military equipment. Larry Ellison collected two fighter jets. As for the VH-60N, it was also not banned. The main reason why no one bought it was that this helicopter was too expensive. An ordinary civilian helicopter could be bought for $200,000 to $300,000 USD. Even the most expensive model in the Black Hawk series was currently sold for less than $10 million USD. However, the two VH-60N that Eric ordered, even without the classified military equipment that couldn't be installed, still cost $33 million US dollars. This was close to the price of a Gulfstream V business jet. Moreover, this was only the beginning. In the future, the annual maintenance cost and the cost of hiring pilots would be a considerable expense. It could be said that in the entire United States, other than the president who was supported by the taxpayers, there were very few rich people who could afford to use a VH-60N as their personal vehicle without caring about the high cost. Even the federal president could only afford to use a VH-60N for 8 years within his annual travel budget. As soon as the VH-60N was activated, Miranda immediately felt the difference in this helicopter. Whether it was in movies or on TV, all the scenes of helicopters were accompanied by loud roars. The pilots had to shout in order to communicate with people. However, at this time, the airflow brought about by the propellers stirred up the surrounding dust, but only a slight buzzing sound could be heard in the cabin. Even talking was not affected. After the helicopter stabilized, Miranda Kerr couldn't wait to unfasten her seatbelt. She knelt on the seat and looked out through the porthole. The entire Los Angeles coastline formed an arc of a bay. From Firefly Cineplex next to Marab Point Manor, the helicopter flew on the sea the entire time. Feeling the helicopter flying over the sea at more than 200 kilometers per hour, Miranda even felt that she could hear the sound of the wind outside the cabin. The girl's mentality could not help but become arrogant. She pointed out the porthole disdainfully and said, "Eric, look, the houses on Marab Beach are like small boxes. They're really ugly. Wow, I can already see the Shell Villa. It's so beautiful. That's a house for people to live in." Eric flipped through a book he received from Lockheed Martin. Recently, he had been reading about this in order to be more integrated into the role of Tony Stark. Hearing what Miranda said, Eric smiled without raising his head and said, "I remember someone just said that she wanted a small box." At this time, Carter Moan and the others were sitting in the back row. When Miranda heard Eric's teasing, she was a little embarrassed and said, "I don't want it at all now." The road from Firefly Cineplex to Point Manor was more than 40 kilometers. It would take about 40 minutes to drive even if there was no traffic. The VH-60N, which had a top speed of nearly 350 kilometers per hour, took less than 15 minutes to land on the tarmac of Point Manor. Miranda Kerr was obviously a little unsatisfied. It was not until they entered the villa that she reluctantly took Eric's arm and asked, "Eric, if you can't accompany me tomorrow, can I use this plane to take a few classmates to Santa Cruz Island?" Santa Cruz Island was more than 60 kilometers west of Marib. It was the largest island in California. At the same time, it also formed the California Channel Islands National Park together with Santa Rosa Island, San Miguel Island and several other islands. The natural environment of these islands was very well preserved, and there were almost no residents there now. It was a very good tourist destination. Eric occasionally went there a few times. Eric took off his coat and planned to go upstairs to take a shower first. Seeing Miranda following him with an expectant look, he nodded and said, "Okay, but you must not spend the night outside. You must come back before dark." Miranda followed Eric up the stairs. She chuckled and said, "I know. In fact, I only plan to go with a few female classmates. I won't bring those messy boys." Eric nodded with satisfaction and said, "Good girl. I like smart girls. Don't follow me. I'm going to take a shower." "Eric, I'll take a shower with you, okay?" "No." Eric immediately shook his head. What a coward. Miranda Kerr complained for the umpteenth time. Although they had been intimate with each other many times, until now, Eric still insisted on not taking her body. This made the girl feel frustrated. "Sooner or later, I'll teach you a lesson." Eric did not care about the girl's provocation. He would not have sex with girls under the age of 16. Starting from Drew, although he often had intimate contact with these little girls, this insistence had never changed. It was not because of the rules or the law. Eric just felt that the more a person reached the peak of wealth and power, the more insistent they should be. "Let's go to the kitchen first and see what we can eat tonight. You still have to make it yourself? You are now the world's first billionaire." Miranda obviously did not have Eric's personality to experience life. If possible, she preferred to be surrounded by a group of servants. She did not have to do anything and only needed to enjoy life. Even billionaires have to have a life. "Do you think I should use gold to build a bed for myself now, and then lay on it with a thick layer of money and do nothing all day?" Eric shook his head with a smile and patted the girl's little butt. "Go ahead. I really want to have such a bed." Miranda looked forward to it for a moment before turning and walking downstairs. After dinner, Eric was dragged to the screening room by Miranda, who also had a tendency to be a night owl, to watch a movie. Halfway through Terminator 2, Eric was so sleepy that he could barely open his eyes. When he woke up in the morning, unsurprisingly, there was a naked body curled up in his arms. It was as if he was holding a piece of soft jade, and it also had a very nice body fragrance. Suppressing the desire in his heart, Eric got up, washed up, and prepared breakfast. He was going to wake up the girl who was lazing in bed, but Miranda appeared in the dining room with today's newspaper in her hand. After being together for so long, this girl still knew that Eric had the habit of reading the newspaper in the morning. "Eric, look, this photo is very good." Miranda smiled and opened a section of the Los Angeles Times. She showed a photo of a black VH-60N helicopter flying over the sponge to Eric. The title was Williams Marine One. It was very gimmicky, or rather, full of resentment. For many days, Eric left only the shadow of this arrogant modified Black Hawk helicopter to the reporters waiting outside Firefly Studios. Unlike the ordinary camouflage Black Hawks or the rustic dark green of the real Marine One, Eric's two VH-60N were very eye-catching black. Even if the photo was printed in a low-resolution newspaper, it still looked very beautiful. Eric took the newspaper, sat down and said, "Let's eat. Didn't you say that you were going to Santa Cruz Island with your classmates today? We'll go to the studio first. You can call your classmates there and ask them to come over. When you come back in the evening, I'll be home from work." Miranda sat down next to Eric, picked up the box of juice on the table, and poured some into Eric's glass. She then said, "I just saw 2 helicopters in the hangar. You want to drive them out together?" Miranda shook her head. "No, but it would be cool." Eric shook his head. "Don't even think about it. You have to keep a low profile. Miranda pointed at the newspaper that was still open, and two small dimples appeared on her cheeks again. You call this keeping a low profile? Of course. Can't you see that we're flying so low? After breakfast, they rushed to Firefly Studios. Eric left Cardamone to deal with Miranda's trip to Santa Cruz Island, and hurried into the studio to start today's shoot. The only scene left in the cave was Tony Stark fighting his way out of the cave in the Mark I armor. Except for saying goodbye to the dying Dr. Ethan, the rest of the scenes didn't require any lines, so it was much simpler. As for the scene outside the cave where Tony Stark destroyed the weapons from Stark Industries, it would still be filmed in the mountains of Eastern California. While Eric was shooting in the studio, some of the crew members had already rushed to Las Vegas in a low-key manner to prepare for the shoot on Monday. Since there were several outdoor scenes in Las Vegas, the crew was very careful to avoid being surrounded by onlookers, and the confidentiality was even stricter. The shoot in the morning went smoothly, and Eric had already finished the scene between Tony Stark and Dr. Ethan when it was close to lunchtime. It was just that in the afternoon, because the Mark I armor would use a flamethrower for safety reasons, everyone in the crew no longer allowed Eric to do it himself. Instead, it was done by a stunt double. The flamethrower that Stan Winston had designed for the Mark I armor was actually two hoses connected to a high-pressure oil pump. The nozzle was installed on the arm of the armor, and the stunt double in the armor had to carry the two long hoses as he walked. This device was indeed dangerous, but it wasn't likely to threaten the stunt double's life. At most, the stunt double would be injured. The crew had already bought insurance for the stunt double, and signed a very strict contract to ensure that in the event of an accident, all parties would be held accountable and wouldn't cause trouble for the crew. Next to the monitor, Eric was still wearing the armor on the lower half of his body. He stood aside and patiently watched Joss Whedon command the stunt double, who was also only wearing half of his armor. He himself only had one last scene left. The stunt double's performance went very smoothly, and there were no accidents during the process. After it was over, a group of people quickly stepped forward with fire extinguishers and sprayed at the still-burning props. Several others had already quickly stepped forward, took off the armor on the stunt double, and put it on Eric. Everyone was in a very relaxed mood at this time. After the next scene was over, they could take a day off tomorrow, and the day after tomorrow, they could go to Las Vegas, the dream of all men. The shooting schedule in Las Vegas was 3 days, and there would definitely be a lot of entertainment time left. Eric only needed to knock down 2 more terrorists who rushed up and walk all the way to the entrance of the cave, and all the scenes would be over. Eric, I want to discuss with you in advance. After the movie is done, can you give this Mark I armor to me? Joss Whedon said with a smile, holding the director's script in his hand, and an equally relaxed expression on his face. That won't do. When the movie is promoted in the future, this armor will definitely be used. Eric shook his head and motioned for the staff to put on the helmet for him. Looking at the somewhat disappointed Joss Whedon, he smiled and said, however, when the movie is released, you can still take it home. Then it's settled. Joss Whedon clapped his hands excitedly, then shouted to everyone around him, okay, everyone get ready. After the last scene is done, everyone can get off work. Eric listened to Joss Whedon's excited tone, and began to walk to his position with a smile. Chapter 963. The last set of shots was not difficult at all. More than 10 minutes later, amidst the cheers and celebrations of everyone on the set, Iron Man's cave imprisonment scene came to an end. After arranging for an assistant director to be in charge of the finishing work, Joss Whedon came to Eric, who had just removed the Mark I armor, and asked, Eric, I will check all the shooting materials during this period tomorrow. Do you want to come with me? When the filming of Iron Man had just begun, Joss Whedon was worried that Eric would interfere too much in the production of the film. However, in the past half a month, he had completely let go of any concerns in this regard. In fact, some of Eric's occasional guidance during the filming process had benefited him a lot as a rookie director for the first time in a big production. Joss Whedon now sincerely hoped to get more advice from Eric. After the filming of the cave scene was completed, the set in the studio would soon be dismantled to make room for other films. Therefore, it would be very troublesome to reshoot this part of the scene, and Eric naturally wanted to personally ensure that nothing went wrong. Although tomorrow was Sunday, Eric did not hesitate to agree when he heard Joss Whedon's invitation. The core creators of the film gathered together to discuss the shooting arrangements for next week, and Eric left the studio. Noticing that Miranda Kerr was not seen until he left the studio this time, Eric asked Carolyn and Selena, who were beside him, "She's not back yet?" Carolyn shook her head. "No, I called 10 minutes ago. Carter said that they were planning to rush back, and should take off now." Today's filming ended early, and it was not even 5 o'clock yet. Eric was not in a hurry. He nodded and walked to his office in the district, intending to take advantage of the time to deal with some work matters. Eric walked into the office and had just turned on the computer when Carolyn quickly knocked on the door and came in. She handed him a folder and said, "Eric, this is the list of films released in the Easter slot that you instructed me to do on Friday. The details and marketing plans of the 3 companies, Firefly, MGM, and Fox, are also in there." Facing the increasingly crowded summer and New Year slots, Eric had been thinking of developing a new popular schedule since last year. In addition to expanding the release cycle of the summer and New Year slots step by step, he first focused on Easter. In the plan, in order to promote 3D and IMAX films, the Real D and 4,200 plans would be implemented at the end of next year. At that time, there would naturally be no shortage of 3D and IMAX films for the New Year slots. Currently, there were 2 confirmed films, Gravity and The Lord of the Rings. However, with only a few 3D and IMAX films for the New Year slots, it was obvious that they would not be able to support the release of films from the New Year slots to the summer. Therefore, the Firefly system had to release at least 2 more 3D and IMAX films in the 6 months between the end of the year and the summer to ensure that the 4,000 3D screens and 200 IMAX screens around the world would not be in a predicament due to the lack of film sources. In the 6 months between the New Year and the summer, the Easter slot was undoubtedly the best time to release new film sources. Easter was the time when American students were on spring break, and teenagers happened to be the group that was most receptive to the new film projection model. Speaking of which, the Easter slot had always existed. Every year, Hollywood would release a lot of films during Easter. However, in the past, the attitude of all the film companies towards the Easter slot was to take advantage of the school holidays to make more money than the more quiet off-season. If there were 1 or 2 box office dark horses, it would be even better. Due to the lack of attention, there were very few big-budget films released during the Easter slot. However, once the Real D and 4,200 plans were implemented, the situation would be different. First of all, because it was still in the era of film, the production cost of each film copy was between $1,000 and $2,000 depending on the length of the film. Although the production cost of a single copy was not high, when this number was multiplied by 2,000 or 3,000, the expenditure would become very large. In the process of film distribution, just a few thousand copies of the film would cost millions of dollars. The dual-mode 3D film was equivalent to directly doubling this cost. The expensive IMAX film cost was equivalent to 10 times the cost of ordinary film. Films released in 3D and IMAX mode could cost more than $10 million just to make copies. Therefore, under the current circumstances, there was no need for low and medium budget movies with a production budget of less than $50 million to enter the 4,200 theaters in Eric's plan. 2 years later, during Easter 2000, the 3D and IMAX movies that took over Gravity and the first part of The Lord of the Rings could only be big-budget movies. In order to ensure that the film would not fail during the Easter slot, Eric planned to cultivate the concept of the Easter slot from this year onwards. The process was probably similar to the later stages of the Double 11 or Black Friday shopping carnival. It was not too complicated. To sum it up, it was nothing more than improving the quality of the movies released during the Easter season, and increasing the publicity and marketing efforts to attract more audiences who would not watch movies during the Easter season to the cinema. According to the information in his hands, MGM planned to focus on Alien during the Easter period. The production cost was $35 million, which was considered a medium-budget production. Speaking of which, the female lead of this sci-fi horror film was originally supposed to be Natasha Henstucker. Natasha Henstucker, who debuted as a model at the age of 14, was also a member of the Victoria's Secret Army. Eric heard the girl talk about the audition last year, but he did not intervene. In the end, the female lead of the film fell to another very beautiful Hollywood actress, Heather Graham. In addition, Heather Graham also had a very good performance in the New Line's Unruly Night last year. During the casting of Iron Man, Eric directly selected the role of Vanity Fair's female reporter, Kristen Everhart, to the Victoria's Secret Army. Linda Evangelista privately gave Eric the nickname Jealous Daddy because of his ban on the Victoria's Secret Angel and Little Lee's relationship. It was quite appropriate. Since he'd personally created the Victoria's Secret Army, Eric didn't mind raising his beautiful babies even higher. Of course, doing so was not without benefits. The higher Eric raised the Victoria's Secret Army, the greater his influence in the fashion industry. Natasha Henstucker did not get the role in Alien. After Eric released the quota, he saw that Natasha Henstucker participated in the audition and gave the role to her. Perhaps because she was a bit angry because she was not optimistic about the prospects of Trump Card 2. Elizabeth took out this nonsensical comedy as Fox's main movie for the Easter season. However, Trump Card 2 had a production budget of $30 million. It could be ranked among the top movies for the Easter season. Moreover, although there were not many expectations for this comedy, as long as it could maintain the North American box office of about $60 million, it could not be considered a failure. Finally, there was a romantic comedy from New Line called The Wedding Singer. The male lead was Adam Sandler. In terms of budget, New Line's The Wedding Singer was the lowest of the three movies. The production cost was only $18 million, which was about half of the production cost of Alien. It could not be compared with the $30 million production cost of Trump Card 2. However, among the three movies, Eric was most optimistic about The Wedding Singer, because he happened to remember this movie. In the original space-time, the female lead of this movie was Drew. Although he did not know the specific box office of The Wedding Singer, Eric knew that the significance of this movie to Adam Sandler was similar to Jim Carrey's Dumb and Melon. This time, Wench would definitely not be involved in this low-budget romantic comedy. However, the female lead who replaced Wench was Jennifer Aniston. This was the result of Eric's intervention. After reconciling with Jennifer Aniston last year, Eric happened to see that New Line was selecting the female lead for this romantic comedy, so he asked Wench to try. Friends had entered the final stage, and now it was time for Jennifer Aniston to turn her energy to the film industry. As for the male lead Adam Sandler, he had been a writer and actor on Saturday Night Live since the early 1990s. As a resident actor on the longest-lived variety show in North America, Adam Sandler was a household name in the United States. Many people often confused Adam Sandler with the Rotten Boys gang, led by Ben Stiller. But in fact, Adam Sandler was not a member of the Rotten Boys gang. His movies had a very obvious personal style. The members of the Rotten Boys gang focused on vulgar comedies with no limits, but Adam Sandler was more inclined to more warm and nonsensical romantic comedies. Of course, as a star who often dominated the list of low return rates in Hollywood, Eric's attitude towards Adam Sandler was similar to that of Jim Carrey, or even worse than that of Jim Carrey. Jim Carrey still had international box office appeal, but Adam Sandler's comedies, most of the time, were like the Rotten Boys gang dramas. The box office appeal was limited to North America. Therefore, after cooperating with Adam Sandler for a few movies, once the other party's salary and project production budget exceeded Firefly's acceptable range, Eric did not intend to cooperate with the other party anymore. After all, Firefly did not lack projects. At the same time, the risk of comedy movies was actually very high. If the salary of the main creator skyrocketed, causing the budget to expand to a large-scale production, the probability of loss would become very high. In fact, this was the reason why Adam Sandler often topped the list of low return rates. Even if the box office was good, the profits were estimated to basically fall into the hands of stars like Adam Sandler. The film company often just made money through hard work. The three movies, Alien, Ace Spy 2, and The Wedding Singer, Although did not meet Eric's expectations, it was enough to support the Easter schedule. Eric hoped to squeeze in a big production movie, but on the one hand, after several consecutive years of explosive growth, the big production projects in Firefly's hands were in the development stage and could be considered to have entered a low point. If he wanted to do this, he could only wait until next year at the earliest. On the other hand, whether it was MGM or Fox, although they had a few heavyweight movies in their hands that could be arranged in the Easter schedule, with the current production scale of these two companies, they did not even have enough projects to fill the summer and New Year slots. Eric could not ask the two companies to give up the popular schedule to be cannon fodder for expansion. After reading the information in his hand, Eric picked up the phone and called Elizabeth and the others to discuss it. When Carolyn knocked on the door again and told Eric that the helicopter had returned, Eric packed up and got ready to go home. After leaving the office building, Eric went all the way to the helipad and saw a group of 7 or 8 girls gathered around Miranda Kerr. It seemed that they had just gotten off the plane and had not left yet. These girls were about the same age as Miranda. Because they were all children of the wealthy district of Beverly High School, they were all dressed casually for a spring outing, simple shirts and jeans, and many of them had ponytails, looking youthful and invincible. Noticing Eric's appearance, the 7 or 8 girls immediately let out a surprised shriek and gathered around him without any hesitation. "Wow, it really is Eric. I thought Miranda was lying to us. Eric, can you give us an autograph?" Chatter, chatter, chatter. Eric suddenly felt a headache coming on. He never disliked being surrounded by a group of beautiful girls, but he disliked girls who were too noisy the most. As if sensing Eric's displeasure, the girls gradually quieted down, but they still boldly surrounded Eric and asked Eric if he could invite them to the Sharp Corner Manor to see the Shell Villa. While Eric was dealing with them, Miranda had already walked over with another girl. Eric was dissatisfied with this girl's self-assertion. But when he saw the appearance of the girl with Miranda, his face suddenly showed a look of surprise. The girl walking with Miranda wasn't very tall. Compared to Miranda, who was already 1.7 meters tall, she was only slightly taller than Miranda's shoulders. She had long blonde hair, and her face was not beautiful. Instead, she looked very young, and there was a small mole on the right side of her cheek. Noticing that Eric was looking at her, the girl's expression showed a little nervousness and panic, but she quickly took the initiative to come over and introduced herself. "Mr. Williams, hello, I am Miranda's classmate. My name is Scarlett Johansson." Eric did not expect to meet the former Black Widow here, but he did not feel too strange. Scarlett Johansson had already debuted a few years ago. Eric had seen her in several movies, but he had never paid too much attention to her. After all, Eric has found from various movies over the years that there are too many actors who will be famous in the future, but are still unknown now. As long as these people have no interaction with him, Eric generally will not give them any special attention. Chapter 964. Eric smiled playfully as he shook Scarlett Johansson's hand. Judging from the small details just now, it wasn't a coincidence that he met Scarlett here. However, Eric did not pursue these thoughts. There were too many people in Hollywood who tried to get close to him. He just said to the girl in front of him, "I know you. You played Sean Connery's daughter in Fatal Trap." After all, it was impossible for a 14 or 15-year-old girl to have any deep thoughts. Scarlett Johansson, who was trying her best to remain calm, suddenly revealed a flattered expression when she heard these words. She stuttered a little. Really, Mr. Williams, how was my acting?" "Very good," Eric praised with a smile. In fact, Scarlett Johansson only had a few very simple scenes in Fatal Trap. She did not have any acting skills at all. However, she was able to get the role of Sean Connery's daughter in this movie, which showed the girl's family's deep connections in Hollywood. Fatal Trap was a crime thriller film from Warner Brothers, which cost $50 million to produce. It was considered a big production. Needless to say, the male lead in this movie was Sean Connery. The female lead, Kate Capshaw, also had a big background. She was Spielberg's wife. Scarlett Johansson was able to play the daughter of Sean Connery and Kate Capshaw when she was just 10 years old a few years ago. This starting point was enough to make 99% of the actors in Hollywood feel powerless. Most actors in Hollywood may not get the opportunity to work with A-list stars until the end of their acting career. When the other girls heard Eric praising Scarlett Johansson, they immediately responded and introduced themselves. Eric patiently listened to the group of girls for a while, then pointed to his watch and said with a smile, "Okay girls, since you are back, I have to go home from work." With a sigh of disappointment, Eric felt that Miranda was very proud of herself and wanted to leave with him. He let go of her and shook his head. "Not today. Go play with your friends, but remember to go back early. I will call Sanchez in the evening to ask if you came home on time." Miranda wanted to show her close relationship with Eric. At this time, she was rejected by Eric in front of a group of girls. She immediately pouted, shook his arm and said coquettishly, "Eric, I don't want to go back to Beverly." "Be good, don't make trouble." Eric was unmoved. Looking at the girls around him, Eric realized that he was too lax with Miranda. This girl was not as smart as he thought. After saying this to Miranda Kerr in a slightly heavier tone, Eric smiled at the other girls and boarded the helicopter with his bodyguard. Looking at the black helicopter roaring away, Scarlett Johansson was a little excited. At first, her mother mysteriously asked her to be on good terms with Miranda, and she was very puzzled. Today's experience, especially when she just saw Eric Williams, made her completely understand her mother's intention. What's more, Eric Williams actually knew her, which was definitely the biggest surprise of the day. Since 1988, Eric's films had made a large number of unknown actors into A-list superstars. Even without the huge wealth under Eric's name, his recent 2 consecutive movies that broke 1 billion yuan in the global box office still made his status in Hollywood reach a point that no one could reach. Although Scarlett was young because she entered the Vanity Fair of Hollywood early, she was more sophisticated than Miranda in the ways of the world. She knew very well that Eric only knew her name, which was a great opportunity for her. Thinking of the movie adaptation of Mike Myra's best-selling novel that she recently auditioned for, if Eric Williams could say a few words for her, she would definitely be able to get the role easily. That role was much more important than the small role in Fatal Trap. It was equivalent to the second female lead. Her mother's connections in Hollywood were not enough to help her get it. It's just that after this time, she didn't know when she would see Eric Williams again. Well, maybe she could ask Miranda for Eric Williams' contact information. "Miranda, what is it like in the Shell Villa? Is Eric very good in bed? When can you take us to the Sharp Corner Manor?" Another chattering sound rang out, interrupting Scarlett's train of thought. Although Eric didn't take Miranda away just now, it didn't affect the other girls' feelings for Miranda. Western girls are very precocious, and none of the girls around Miranda are ignorant of the world. They are not sensitive to issues such as age, but they are very envious of Miranda being able to become Eric Williams' little girlfriend. Therefore, as soon as Eric left, Miranda was immediately surrounded by questions again. Surrounded by her sisters, Miranda Kerr's original loss quickly dissipated, and she soon became arrogant. Jilly made up her mind and went forward with a smile on her face. Iron Man didn't have many scenes in Las Vegas, but as one of the most popular hotels in Las Vegas, Caesar Palace naturally couldn't be closed to cooperate with the shooting of the film. After coordination, the crew will use 3 days to shoot the relevant scenes. Eric left Los Angeles early Monday morning with the crew's team and headed for Las Vegas. He wanted to fly to Las Vegas in his VH-60N helicopter. That way, even if he set off from the Sharp Corner Manor in Malibu, it would only take an hour and a half to reach his destination, but it would take him an entire morning to follow the crew's team. However, Eric felt that filming was like an army marching to war in ancient times. As the core of the crew, it was best for him to share the joys and sorrows of the staff. The crew had booked a mid-range suite in the Caesar Palace Hotel for everyone to stay in. Naturally, Eric couldn't choose the villa apartment he used to live in, and he couldn't bear to live in a hotel now. However, if he lived in his own house, it wouldn't be a problem. Eric's assistant office had prepared a villa for Eric in Las Vegas as usual. After arriving in Las Vegas, the crew didn't have any scenes in the afternoon. They were only setting up for the banquet where Colonel Rhodes would present Tony Stark with the Apex Award the next day. Although the scene would be shot at night, as an indoor scene, it wouldn't be a problem to shoot during the day. For the first half a month, the filming of the cave scenes had basically been between Eric and Ed Harris, who played Dr. Ethan. This time Jeff Bridges, Don Cheadle, Natasha Henstridge and Larry Ellison, who had been tricked by Eric to play a small role, would all be on set. In a buffet restaurant in Caesar Palace, the crew, who had traveled hundreds of kilometers, were having a meal. After the long journey, most of them were a little tired, but the atmosphere in the restaurant was very lively. Eric, on the other hand, was hiding at a table in the corner of the restaurant, discussing the acquisition of Virgin Records with Barry Weiss, the president of Firefly Records, who had just returned from Europe. It had been 2 months since they came into contact with Virgin Records' parent company, EMI Records. Since a week ago, EMI hasn't made any concessions. They've kept the price at $1. $3 billion, which is $100 million higher than the upper limit we agreed on. I've been in contact with EMI's senior management a few more times, but there was no result. I could only fly back and let you decide. Barry Weiss explained the current situation in one breath. He looked at the food that he had just taken from the buffet table, but it was very difficult for him to have an appetite. He just picked up the purified water beside him and drank a mouthful, then looked at Eric, waiting for him to make a decision. Eric had no intention of starting to eat. His fingers tapped on the table gently. After a while he said, "If we give up on acquiring Virgin Records, do you think EMI will still be able to find a buyer to get rid of this burden?" Barry Weiss hesitated for a moment, then said truthfully, "It's basically impossible for the price to exceed $1 billion. Virgin Records' actual value now is no more than $800 million. Other than us, no other buyer will be willing to take over at a high price." Then there's no problem. Although Virgin Records has declined for a few years, its foundation is still there. This is also the reason why we are willing to take over. If we delay for a few more years, Virgin Records will probably rot from the roots. At that time, not to mention $1 billion, even if it's halved, no one will be interested in it. So, although Firefly really needs Virgin, as long as EMI's management is a little rational, they will not miss this good opportunity to get rid of this burden. Eric shrugged and said, "So you call them later and tell them our highest offer, $1. $2 billion. Ask EMI to give us an accurate answer tomorrow. If they refuse, there's no need to discuss this business anymore." Barry Weiss, on the other hand, was a little worried. "Eric, I think $1.3 billion is not unacceptable. $1. $2 billion, $1.3 billion for Firefly Group, there's really not much difference," Eric said. "However, Barry, since we set the highest price of $1.2 billion, we have to stick to it. If we make a concession this time, there will definitely be concessions in the future. Step by step, one day you will find that you have nowhere to go. Virgin Records is our best choice, but it's definitely not the only choice. If this deal fails, as long as you want, I can still give you a budget of $1.2 billion to expand the Firefly Records department. So, you think about it carefully. I'll go talk to Joss and the others for a while." After Eric finished speaking seriously, he picked up his plate and walked to Joss Whedon and the others. He no longer paid attention to Barry Weiss, who was in a state of worry. Although Eric admired Barry Weiss's talent in managing a record company, if he did not even have this kind of decisiveness, even if he left Firefly Group, Eric would not feel that it was a pity. When he walked to the table of Joss Whedon, Jeff Bridges, Larry Ellison and the others, Eric happened to hear Larry Ellison, who had shaved off his stubble, asking Joss Whedon how to play Happy Hogan. He looked like he was going to do whatever he wanted. Since he learned that Eric was going to play Tony Stark, Larry Ellison had been trying to steal Eric's limelight. Eric could also see Larry Ellison's thoughts, but he was not worried at all. Instead, he was very happy. The role of Happy Hogan did not even have a few lines. And Larry Ellison did not have the strong aura of a veteran Hollywood actor like Jack Nicholson in front of the camera. It was basically impossible for him to steal the limelight of the protagonist. Eric was originally worried that Larry Ellison would handle the situation. If that was the case, he would rather replace him at the last minute. Noticing Eric coming over, Natasha Henscrooge, who had been listening carefully to the conversation between the men, immediately patted the empty seat next to her and said with a beautiful smile, "Eric, sit here." As soon as Eric nodded, Larry Ellison protested discontentedly, "Hey Natasha, that's not right. Beautiful women should be reserved and wait for men to come up to them. You can't do the other way around." Natasha Henscrooge did not mind Larry Ellison's teasing at all. She said generously, "Mr. Ellison, I've been waiting for you to come up to me, but unfortunately you only have eyes for Mr. Director." This teasing was obviously much harsher than Larry Ellison's, and everyone couldn't help but laugh. Eric also put down his plate with a smile and sat down next to Natasha Henscrooge. Smelling the pleasant perfume on the girl, he asked, "So Larry, what were you talking about with Joss just now?" "Eric, I've been reading the Iron Man comics again. Happy Hogan is a very important character, so don't you think I don't appear in this movie too much? Larry, I think, since you're only paid $1, you should be stingy. Don't think about doing more than $1 worth of work." Before Eric could continue, Larry Ellison once again showed a bitter expression and complained, "To be precise, I paid $4,999,999. Eric corrected him seriously, "That's advertising sponsorship, not paying. We have a contract. It's very formal." Laughter rang out again. After lunch, Barry Weiss made up his mind. After chatting with Eric for a while, he left the Caesar Palace Hotel and planned to return to Los Angeles immediately. Eric didn't need to participate in the setting and rehearsal work in the afternoon. He was planning to go back to his residence in Las Vegas to rest for a while, when Natasha Henscrooge came over. "Eric, you don't have work in the afternoon, right? Can you tell me about our scene together?" Everyone gradually left the restaurant. Eric also walked out with Natasha Henscrooge and said with a smile, "Shouldn't it be the director's privilege to talk to beautiful actresses? Joss will probably hate me if he finds out." Natasha Henscrooge rolled her eyes at Eric, but her expression was quite charming. "I just want to practice my lines with you. I don't care what you men think." Eric smiled and said, "Then come with me. I bought a villa near the Las Vegas Country Club. We'll stay there for a few days." Natasha Henscrooge showed a worried expression, not knowing if it was true or not. "You're not going to take me out to do something, are you? Will you resist?" "Do you want me to resist? The harder the better." "Okay, stop rolling your eyes. My assistant will come with us, and there will be bodyguards." Chapter 965. Eric left the Caesars Palace Hotel with Natasha Henscrooge. They drove along the Las Vegas Boulevard for less than 4 kilometers, then turned east through the Las Vegas Convention and Exhibition Center, and arrived at a golf and country club. Las Vegas was located in the middle of the desert. It was dry all year round, and the number of green plants in the city was pitifully low. Everywhere was barren. However, when the car drove into the country club, it was as if they had entered a different world. Although it was still March, the country club had a large number of evergreen trees and green meadows, giving off the feeling of an oasis in the desert. Natasha Henscrooge looked at the scenery outside the car window, but was a little confused. "Eric, isn't this a golf course? Why are you living here?" "There are residential areas inside." Eric was flipping through a document. Hearing that, he looked up and smiled. "However, it's also my first time here. You'll know later." After only a few words, the car had moved on the asphalt road for dozens of meters. Natasha Henstucker soon saw the villas surrounded by golf courses. She couldn't help but secretly stick out her tongue, thinking that her question just now must have been very ignorant. However, almost every major city had a residential area next to a golf course. But it was her first time seeing a villa built inside a golf course. Thinking about it carefully, in a city surrounded by desert like Las Vegas, it was indeed the best choice to build a villa inside an oasis like a golf course. After driving for a few hundred meters, the car quickly drove into a mansion. Eric got out of the car with Natasha Henscrooge, and Carolyn and Melanie, who had rushed over in advance, greeted them. When Carolyn saw Natasha Henscrooge's figure, the smile on her pretty face quickly disappeared, and a faint sense of inferiority appeared. Natasha Henscrooge walked up with Eric, and Carolyn couldn't help but use the tips of her flats to stomp on the ground. The woman in front of her was wearing high heels and was 30 centimeters taller than her. Carolyn could only reach her shoulders. "Natasha, this is my assistant, Melanie Gleason and Carolyn Wilson," Eric introduced. Noticing that Carolyn began to blink, he knew that this girl was feeling inferior when she saw Natasha. Natasha Henscrooge smiled and shook hands with Melanie. After introducing herself, she reached out to the petite girl in a white hoodie and washed jeans. Even without looking at Carolyn's current attire, Natasha found it hard to imagine that Carolyn was Eric's assistant. She only felt that the doll-like girl in front of her was truly too adorable. She even had the urge to stretch out her hand and pinch the girl's tender cheeks. Therefore, she couldn't imagine that Carolyn was actually a few years old. "Hello, Miss Henscrooge," Carolyn, who had been taught etiquette since childhood, reflexively reached out to shake hands with Natasha Henscrooge. "It's nice to meet you." "Then let's go in and see the house," Eric said after the three girls greeted each other. He noticed that a strand of hair fell on Carolyn's shoulder after she turned around, and it seemed to be tangled with the rope of the hoodie. He naturally reached out to help her tidy it up, and he didn't forget to smile. "I told you little Carolyn looks the best in this dress." Carolyn felt Eric's considerate little action, but she couldn't help but glance at Natasha Henscrooge, who was walking on the other side of Eric, and whispered with some dissatisfaction, "Eric, you can't call me that." Eric nodded. I know. Can you remove the word little?" Carolyn's cheeks, which were already hot, suddenly turned red. When Melanie saw that Eric was bullying Carolyn again, she wanted to mock him, but considering that Natasha Henscrooge was present, she had to give up and just rolled her eyes at him. After walking into the villa, Melanie didn't have the intention to introduce this mansion to Eric in detail. She simply said, "Eric, because time was tight, we just asked people to replace all the furniture with new ones according to the original style. The decorations in the house haven't been touched. If you don't like it, I can ask people to come over and clean it up." Eric casually looked at the villa. Unlike other traditional houses, the layout of the villa in front of him was somewhat eclectic. The living room was not big, and the floor was covered with marble. There was a spiral staircase in the corridor in front of him that led upstairs, and he could see the balcony on the second floor when he looked up. The overall decoration style was more European, with white as the main color. There were some abstract paintings hanging on the walls, and there were bonsai vases and other decorations in the corners. Retracting his gaze, Eric felt that Melanie was no longer talking, so he looked at her. Melanie had no choice but to say, "The bodyguards have installed a new security system. They are staying in the hotel opposite the club. If anything happens, Carter and the others will rush over in 2 minutes, and the security in the neighborhood will also receive the alarm. That's all, Eric. If there's nothing else, Carly and I will go back to Caesar Palace." Eric knew that Melanie was using the Cold War to fight for justice for Carolyn, so he wasn't angry. He just nodded and said, "Okay, you can go back first. You can take Carly around these 2 days. There are still many fun places in Las Vegas." Melanie smiled and nodded in a very formal way, then walked out with Carolyn. After being pulled out of the villa by Melanie, Carolyn couldn't help but look back and say, "Melanie, it's not good for you to do this." Melanie opened the door of the car that the company had temporarily arranged for them and sat in the driver's seat. Looking at Carolyn, who was sitting in the front passenger seat, she said, "Silly girl, I'm doing this for you." Carolyn immediately pinched the corner of her clothes with a guilty conscience. She was also a little sad as she whispered to herself, I'm too small." "You're too timid." Melanie started the car and drove out of the country club. Her tone was somewhat resentful. TSK, a 27-year-old little virgin. This is the first time I've seen someone like you. If I were you, I would have found an opportunity to get naked and crawl into his bed. With boss's temper, he will definitely not ignore you in the future." Hearing Melanie's valiant suggestion, Carolyn's face immediately turned as red as an apple. Her eyes looked out of the window and she retorted, He didn't ignore me." Melanie sighed again. After thinking for a while, she stretched out her hand and patted Carolyn's little shoulder, saying, "Actually, that fellow is definitely not as good as you think. You've just never liked someone before, that's all. Your little brain has a one-track mind. Actually, it's not bad for a girl to give her first time to a boy she likes. If you're willing, I'll help you this once. Get closer to him and look at him more often. I reckon that you'll slowly give up." Carolyn quickly blinked her eyes a few times, her small voice trembling. "Melanie, what do you want to help me with?" Melanie patted the steering wheel and said, "Of course, I want to help you not become a 28-year-old little virgin." Hearing those words, Carolyn finally forgot the ladylike etiquette that she had cultivated since childhood. Like a frightened kitten, she loudly said, "How can I do that?" Melanie glanced at Carolyn and didn't say anything else, continuing to drive. After a while, Carolyn finally let go of the door handle and gave up the idea of jumping out of the car to escape. She silently bent her legs and curled up her little body on the seat. When they were almost at Caesar Palace, Melanie opened her mouth again. "Hey, I'll ask you one more time. If you're not willing, just shake your head. If you're willing, you don't have to say anything. I'll help you find an opportunity." Carolyn raised her chin that was resting on her knees and stared blankly for a while before softly putting it down again. Melanie turned the steering wheel and parked the car in the parking lot of Caesar Palace. She didn't push open the door to get out of the car. Instead, she hugged Carolyn's petite body and patted her lightly. "Then it's settled. When the time comes, if you're sad, you can cry to me, but you're not allowed to do anything stupid." "I won't do anything stupid," Carolyn finally said softly when she felt Melanie's concern. "That's hard to say. You're so silly." In the mansion of the country club, the two women left. Eric took off his coat and hung it on the hanger. He looked at Natasha Henstucker, who was pacing around curiously with her hands behind her back, and asked, "Do you want to drink anything?" "Well, black tea or anything." Natasha Henstucker blurted out her preference but quickly changed her mind. Eric smiled and said, "Then I'll go and see if they've prepared black tea." "Thank you. Do you need my help?" "No, you're a guest." Eric shook his head and said, "If you're interested, you can look around." Natasha Henstucker didn't refuse. She watched as Eric walked to the kitchen on the right. She also took off her light gray women's short windbreaker and wore only a knit shirt and white casual pants. She walked towards the spiral staircase in front of her in her high heels. Eric didn't have the habit of drinking tea, but Carolyn and the others still prepared tea for him. After boiling the water and making the tea, Eric left the kitchen and called out to the girl who couldn't be seen. After getting a response, he followed the sound and carried the tray up the spiral staircase to the second floor. On the second floor, Eric saw an open living room next to a row of floor-to-ceiling windows facing the sun. Natasha Henstucker got up from the sofa and walked over. She took the tray from Eric's hand, and the two of them sat down on the sofa by the window. Although the second floor wasn't very high, sitting by the window they could still see most of the golf course. Natasha Henstucker poured tea for Eric and herself. She held the cup and leaned comfortably on the sofa with her long legs curled up lazily. She looked out of the window and said, "It's really nice here." Eric also held the cup and said, "Should I say that I think it's nice and I'll stay here for a few days?" "Haha, if you say so, I'll stay. Maybe I won't leave." Chapter 966. If he continued to speak like this, it would be flirting. Eric picked up the teacup and brought it to his mouth, intending to ease the ambiguous atmosphere. Noticing Eric's reaction, a hint of a smile appeared on Natasha Henstucker's beautiful face. She even purposely spread her long legs and posed in a more flirtatious manner. All the angels in the Victoria's Secret army knew that Eric had a penchant for legs. In fact, even if Eric came over and pressed her on the sofa, she wouldn't resist. Before getting this role, Natasha Henstucker's position in the Victoria's Secret Corps was not outstanding. But she really felt the great change that the title of Victoria's Secret Angel brought to her life. She debuted at the age of 14 and was now 24 years old. In the fashion industry, where the elimination rate was very high, usually at this age, if a model hadn't reached the height of supermodels such as Cindy Crawford and Linda Evangelista, their career would begin to decline. But now, Even if they weren't the supermodels that Victoria's Secret focused on, with the help of the Angel Halo, they could easily get a variety of endorsements, advertisements, and runway shows. Their annual income was almost the same as the top models before the Victoria's Secret show. And all of this originated from the man in front of her, who was lazily leaning on the sofa. A person's power never depended on how much wealth they had, but on their influence in a circle, an industry, and even a country. Eric personally created the Victoria's Secret show, which was known as the Super Bowl of the fashion industry, plus the resources of the entire Firefly system, so his influence in the circle was definitely far greater than that of Anna Wintour and Karl Lagerfeld, who seemed to have unlimited potential in the fashion industry. Eric's slightly mischievous ban on Victoria's Secret angels and Zyalizi's relationship earned him the nickname Jealous Daddy, but so far, no one in the Angel Corps dared to challenge this ban. Even the major modeling agencies secretly told their contracted models not to contact Leonardo. In the early months of the first Victoria's Secret show, Eric left a deep impression on the first-generation Victoria's Secret angels. All of the Victoria's Secret angels treated Eric with reverence and admiration. Facing this man whom she could only look up to, Natasha Henschutz was looking forward to something happening between them, even if she had no intention of asking for it. Eric didn't speak for a long time. He just crossed his legs and leaned against the armrest of the sofa. He stared at the golf course outside the window. The black tea in his hand gradually lost its steam. Of course, Natasha Henstucker did not know that Eric was used to being alone all of a sudden. He enjoyed being in a daze for a while. She only relied on the delicate mind of a woman to feel that Eric seemed to be isolated from the rest of the world, and seemed a little lonely. Natasha instinctively wanted to pull him out of this state, so she called out softly, "Eric?" Being interrupted, Eric was not displeased. He turned his head and looked at her. Yes. Seeing that Eric had come back to his senses, Natasha suddenly regretted speaking. Her eyes flashed, and she casually found a topic to talk about. "Why do you want to play Tony Stark yourself?" "Everyone else's auditions weren't very good," Eric explained. "The only one with a good price that I was satisfied with had been shuttling between Los Angeles prison and rehab for the past few years. I don't know if he'll turn over a new leaf, so I had to do it myself." "But," Natasha Henschutz raised her hand and made a meaningless gesture. "You have so much money now. Do you still need to do these things yourself?" "This is my job. Whether it's directing or acting, this is what I'm really good at. As for the other things, I'll only leave them to more professional people. Also, the Marvel superhero movie involves Firefly again. It's a big setup, so it's not a bad idea for me to watch it myself." Eric explained, put down the cold black tea in his hand, and said, "It's about time. Let's rehearse." Natasha Henschutz sat up straight and said, "Are we really going to rehearse?" "This is what you asked for." Eric smiled and got up. "So if you can't satisfy me later, I'll teach you a good lesson. How's your line?" Natasha Henschutz got up with Eric and said, "I'm very familiar with it. I don't need a script at all." "Eric, where are you going?" "I'm going to find a DV to use as a monitor. This way, I can see the effect of your performance more directly. I've seen your audition video. It's only a passing grade. It's still far from perfect." Natasha Henschutz suddenly had a bad feeling in her heart. She recalled that during the rehearsals for the first Victoria's Secret fashion show a few years ago, Eric would often mercilessly scold the angels of Victoria's Secret who had made mistakes until they cried. The scene back then was still vivid in her mind. The respect that the first generation of Victoria's Secret angels had for Eric was also cultivated back then. Of course, many Victoria's Secret angels also developed another skill that allowed them to cry at any time. When Eric was angry, their tears were definitely the best extinguisher. As long as the tears fell, Eric's tone would soften. The memories in her mind made Natasha Henschutz forget to put on her shoes. Watching Eric leave the living room, she subconsciously tiptoed and followed him like a cat. At the same time, she did not forget to build up her emotions. She blinked and felt that her eyes were wet. Only then did she feel relieved. Fortunately, the skill was still there. Her female assistant had just lost her temper and left without introducing the interior of the villa to Eric. This luxurious villa covered an area of 1,500 square meters, with 4 living rooms, 2 kitchens, 6 bedrooms, and 9 bathrooms. Including the study, the gym, the screening room, and the storage room, there were a total of 33 rooms. Eric could only fumble around to find the study. Carolyn and Natasha would basically help him put the daily necessities in the study. After a long while, Eric came out of the study with a camera tripod. Behind him, Natasha was holding a laptop, a DV camera, and a complete script for Iron Man. Back in the living room, Eric installed the tripod and connected the DV camera to the laptop. Then he sat down on the sofa with the script in his hand. He pointed to the opposite side and said, "Here, tell me your understanding of this character first." Natasha Henstridge thought for a moment and gestured with her hands unconfidently. "I think that Kristen Everhart is a, well, somewhat bitter character." As soon as Natasha opened her mouth, Eric couldn't help but shake his head and say, No, definitely not bitter. She doesn't have menopause syndrome. If you play her as a bitter and mean middle-aged woman, I will kick you back to New York immediately." Natasha immediately shrunk her neck. Although she had memorized her lines in advance, as a rookie in Hollywood, she really didn't know how to understand the character in a deeper way. When Eric asked, she could only improvise according to her feelings. Seeing Natasha's reaction, Eric also realized that his attitude was a little inappropriate. The female reporter of Vanity Fair, Kristen Everhart, was a very domineering character. If he scolded Natasha too harshly, it would be basically impossible for him to get her spirit back in the short term. Furthermore, her scenes would be filmed the day after tomorrow. In the original space-time, Natasha Henstridge was a little famous in Hollywood through the Alien series. However, although she had a lot of later works and had worked with big names such as Bruce Willis, she was basically taking the route of a commercial vase. He shouldn't have too much expectation for her foundation. After calming down, Eric said softly, "Well, let's take it slow. First of all, you need to build such a character from the bottom of your heart." Kristen Everhart, a reporter for Vanity Fair, graduated from Brown University, an Ivy League school. She is a genius and a social elite. Because of this background and identity, she is confident, competitive, energetic, likes to question everything, dares to challenge authority, and is used to tit for tat. All the plots and lines about her in the script are inseparable from these characteristics of her personality. Natasha Henstridge listened attentively to Eric's story. She knew that this was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for her, perhaps a once-in-a-lifetime one. However, after Eric finished speaking, the girl still gently raised her right hand. Eric was helpless, but instead of being harsh this time, he said somewhat encouragingly, "Don't joke with me, okay? Put your hand down and be more confident. From now on, you can think of yourself as Kristen Everhart. If you have any doubts, just ask directly." As expected, Natasha Henstridge straightened her back and said, "Eric, given Kristen's proud and confident personality, I don't think he'll sleep with Tony Stark the first time they meet. What you just said is very good. It's not a question, but a very confident affirmation. This is very in line with Kristen's personality." Eric didn't immediately answer Natasha's doubts. Instead, he nodded and praised her before he said, "Then about the part about sleeping with Tony Stark. First of all, Tony Stark is both a billionaire and a genius scientist. Although he's arrogant, he's generous, witty, and elegant, which can be very attractive to women. Secondly, although Tony Stark was the one who initiated the seduction, Kristen Everhart wasn't passive. She was also a hunter, and even insisted on pressing Tony Stark down in bed to fight for the initiative. In this regard, she was also a feminist, and didn't think that sex was exclusive to men. In the next few scenes, although the two of them slept together, Kristen's attitude towards Tony didn't change at all, which can prove the above point. Natasha Henstridge nodded. Eric's thorough understanding of the script made her feel a little embarrassed. However, thinking of Eric's advice just now, she didn't show any guilty expression. She tried her best to maintain the mentality of Kristen Everhart that she had just developed. She said, "Eric, I didn't see any description of the sex scene you mentioned in the script. There will only be one scene of this scene, of course, there won't be any special description." Eric shook his head and said, Do you have any other doubts? No. Well, let's try to act it out first. Let me see how you're prepared in this regard. As Eric spoke, he got up and turned on the DV camera. He then handed the TV remote control next to him to Natasha as a recording pen. He then clapped his hands and said, "Okay, let's start with the scene outside the casino. Don't be nervous, we have plenty of time." Natasha Henskutch more or less established an image of Kristen Everhart in her heart. Eric's unusual patience also made Natasha Henskutch relax. She exhaled softly and walked out of the living room. Under Eric's gesture, she calmly walked forward and handed the recording pen to Eric. She went straight to the point. "Mr. Stark, some people say that you're the modern Leonardo da Vinci. What do you think?" "Nonsense, I'm not a painter." "Don't you have insomnia in your line of work? I'd be happy to have a few sleepless nights with you." Seeing that Natasha Henskutch's expression slowly changed, Eric clapped his hands softly, indicating that it was over. It was her first time acting in a face-to-face interview, but Natasha did not stutter at all during the whole process, which meant that she had indeed put in a lot of effort in private. Eric was very satisfied with this and said, "Very good, let's see the effect first." The two of them walked to the laptop together. Eric clicked on the replay and replayed their performance just now. After all, it was their first time acting together, and the effect was so-so. Natasha was basically reciting her lines according to the rules. "First of all, I can be sure that your lines are absolutely fine," Eric said to Natasha next to him after watching the scene just now. "However, you need to change your expressions more. Also, you don't have to be so rigid when you recite your lines. If the lines are too precise, it means that you're not actually in the role and don't really think of yourself as Kristen Everhart. To change this, I'll give you some lines later. You need to adapt to the situation. Once you do that, you'll more or less be in the role." After giving a brief analysis, Eric began to explain to Natasha in detail the details that needed to be adjusted. Very soon, the two of them entered the second performance. For the rest of the afternoon, in the villa and the country club, the two of them repeatedly rehearsed the scenes between Tony Stark and Kristen Everhart. Later, Eric even played the role of Pepper, and rehearsed the tit-for-tat scene between Kristen and Pepper Potts several times. It was not until dusk fell that the two of them finally stopped rehearsing. Natasha Henstucker took the initiative to prepare dinner, and Eric took the time to turn on his work phone that he had turned off in the afternoon to return some missed calls. Not long after, in the villa's brand new dining room, Natasha prepared dinner. Eric opened a bottle of red wine and poured it into 2 glasses. He handed one to Natasha and sat down in his seat. Looking at the girl who still looked a little tired, he said, "Do you feel that it's not worth it to spend so much effort on such a small role?" "Of course not." Natasha Everhart shook her head. She had seen the difference between her last rehearsal in the afternoon and her initial performance. In the beginning, she felt that she was completely a block of wood. She gave the impression that she was performing, and it was a very stiff performance. There was not much expression on her face, and her fluent lines made her look like she was reciting from a book. But in the end, with Eric's patient guidance down to every line and action, her role as the reporter for Vanity Fair came to life, and the interaction between the two of them was very natural. Natasha even felt that there was another soul named Kristen Everhart in her heart. Eric nodded. "Since you don't feel that way, we'll continue tomorrow." "Huh." Natasha, who had just picked up the glass of red wine, looked at Eric with a pleading expression. After an afternoon of hard work, she felt that the effect of her performance was already very good. Also, she really did not want to continue this boring repetition. Eric ignored Natasha's pitiful expression and said, "Do you remember what you said to Larry at noon?" Natasha Henstridge nodded. She naturally remembered her teasing to Larry Ellison. "You see, Larry Ellison's role as Happy Hogan is almost the same as yours in this movie, and it's almost the same as a cameo. However, during lunch, he spent most of the time patiently asking Joss and the others how to play this small role. Also, Larry only took $1, and I even cheated him out of $5 million in sponsorship fees. It's impossible for him to develop in Hollywood in the future, but he has no intention of playing this role perfunctorily. Instead, he wants to play this role as well as possible. Why do you think that is? Natasha really could not figure out what Larry Ellison was thinking, but she tactfully took the initiative to surrender. She raised the glass of red wine towards Eric and said, "Okay, Eric, we'll continue tomorrow." Eric raised his glass to the girl and took a sip of red wine. He smiled and continued, "There is a kind of person in this world who will instinctively do their best in everything they encounter. Therefore, they are often seen as successful in the eyes of ordinary people. I don't have such high expectations for you beautiful babies. However, this role is a very good opportunity for you. Although you don't have many scenes, this role is still very easy to stand out. If you can leave a deep impression on the audience, not only will it increase your fame worldwide, but it will also give you a key to enter Hollywood. This kind of opportunity is hard to come by for most actors in Hollywood in their lifetime." Natasha rubbed the glass of red wine and looked across the table with her cheek in her other hand. After listening to Eric carefully, she said with a smile, "Eric, why are you so good to us?" "Because I also want to do the best in everything I do. You were created by me, so I hope that each of you can stand as high as possible." Natasha suddenly understood. She smiled even more brightly and said, "We stand higher so that people can't touch us, right?" "That's right. Haha, I suddenly realized that Linda's nickname for you is really appropriate. I also suddenly feel that I should reward Linda for giving me a nickname when I go to New York next time." Natasha smiled and didn't say anything. She just put the glass of red wine to her lips and took a sip, then began to eat dinner slowly. After dinner, Natasha eagerly cleaned up the tableware. Eric went to the living room upstairs again, turned on the TV, and then leaned on the spacious sofa with his laptop and began to check today's email. A moment later, Natasha Henstucker also came upstairs. She went straight to the French windows and drew the sky blue curtains. Then she turned and walked to Eric. Feeling the girl's two long legs swaying in the corner of his eyes, Eric didn't look up. He continued to type on the keyboard and said casually, "Sleep here tonight. It's much more comfortable than the hotel. If you don't want to be attacked by me at night, lock the door." Before he finished his words, the laptop in his arms was taken away by a pair of white hands. Eric looked up. Natasha had already leaned over and pushed Eric down on the sofa. She sat on his waist and reached for the collar of his shirt. However, she didn't manage to pull it open. Maybe it was because she was too weak, or because Eric's shirt was too strong. Eric looked at the beautiful face covered by the blonde hair directly above him. He didn't resist and reached out to hug the girl's slender waist. He smiled and said, "Well, the way you unbutton is wrong. I've seen people who can unbutton with their tongue. However, can you first explain what kind of mental state you are in now?" Natasha didn't pull Eric's collar. She didn't feel embarrassed at all. She straightened up and took off her undershirt. She flirted with her beautiful blonde hair and said condescendingly, "Mr. Williams, you have been teasing me for the whole afternoon today. It just happened once just now. So I think I need to take revenge." Eric's hands slid up the girl's slender waist and into the gap of her bra. He felt the amazing touch in his palms and said, "I thought you were going to rehearse your second scene in Iron Man first." "Of course, Mr. Stark." Although the girl's face had begun to turn red, her temperament instantly changed. She proudly pulled Eric's two perverted hands out of her bra and pressed them on the top of his head. She leaned over and bit Eric's neck a few times in a wild manner, saying, "So, resist to your heart's content." Chapter 967. In the dark bedroom, the alarm clock on the bedside table only beeped twice before a hand reached out and pressed it down, and it instantly went silent. Turning on the lamp, the beautiful woman withdrew her hand and patted the shoulder of the man who was sleeping soundly on the other side. "Eric, it's 2 o'clock. We should go to the set." Being woken up from a deep sleep, Eric couldn't help but feel a little grumpy. He rudely reached out and hugged Natasha Henstucker. Pressing his cheek against the woman's chest, he sniffed her charming body fragrance and snuggled comfortably for a while before he finally opened his eyes. "Do you think I should act like a big shot and be 30 to 50 minutes late or something?" It was already the third day since the crew arrived in Las Vegas. Yesterday, The crew had completed the banquet scene where Colonel Rhodes presented the Apex Award to Tony Stark. Vanity Fair reporter Kristen Everhart's interview with Tony Stark was scheduled between 2 o'clock in the morning and 6 o'clock in the morning. The Caesars Palace Hotel only allowed the crew to clear the set for 4 hours during this period. At the same time, the Caesars Palace Hotel only gave the crew 3 hours of shooting from 6 o'clock in the morning to 9 o'clock in the morning. The casino, which was open 24 hours a day, was only slightly quieter during this period. Because they had to work from 2 o'clock in the morning to 9 o'clock in the morning, Eric had gone to bed early last night to conserve energy. After Eric let go of her, Natasha Henstucker lowered her head and kissed him on the lips. She then sat up and put on the bra next to her. Sure. Maybe everyone will be happy. If you act like a big shot this time, everyone will be able to stay in Las Vegas for a few more days. Eric stroked the girl's smooth back and slowly slid his hand down the graceful curve of her back. His fingers didn't stop until they touched the edge of her underwear. He said, "You look so energetic. Don't tell me you haven't slept at all?" "Yeah, it's my first time shooting a movie. I can't sleep." Natasha Henstucker put on a tight vest and smiled. She shook off Eric's weird hand and got out of bed. "I'm going to wash up. You should get dressed too." Seeing the girl's graceful figure disappear into the bathroom door, Eric stretched his arms and sat up abruptly. The small square outside Caesar's Palace was already bustling with activity. Filming a movie was never an easy task. A few seconds on the big screen might seem simple, but it might take the crew 3 to 5 days. For some big scenes, the preparation time alone might take 10 days to half a month. The scenes between Eric and Natasha lasted less than 2 minutes. However, on the first night the crew arrived in Las Vegas, Joss Whedon had brought his team to the set to study the shooting plan over and over again. From the camera position to the lighting method, and even the position of the extras, everything had to be carefully arranged. In the movie, when Tony Stark was interviewed by Kristen, there were bustling cars and pedestrians in the background, but absolutely none of them were real passers-by. It wasn't easy to coordinate these extras. Therefore, Joss Whedon was actually very anxious because in his opinion, 4 hours wasn't enough at all. When he thought of Natasha Henstucker, who was going to appear in this scene, Joss Whedon felt even more depressed. He had seen Natasha Henstucker's audition. As a Victoria's Secret Angel supermodel, this stunner naturally had impeccable camera sense, but she was ultimately a movie rookie. If Eric hadn't personally made the decision, he would never have agreed to let her play this role. Joss Whedon had originally planned to use the 2 days to rehearse the scene a few times in advance. Of course, it would be a real rehearsal. Given this woman's relationship with Eric, no one would dare have any ideas about her. However, he hadn't seen her show up at all in the past 2 days. What was there to talk about? As for the fact that she had received personal guidance from Eric at his place, well, everyone here was smart enough to just listen. Although he wasn't optimistic about the prospects of this shoot, Joss Whedon still did his best to buy as much time as possible. The time limit for Caesar's Palace was from 2 to 6 in the morning. The crew had to clear the set and leave before 6 in the morning. However, at 1:30 in the morning, several trucks carrying props from the crew were waiting on the road nearby. Just after 2 in the morning, they hurried over to clear the set and seal off the filming area. Eric and Natasha arrived at the set at 2:30. Several bright lights were set up in the small square, and several staff members had already started to instruct the extras on the positions of the extras. Joss Whedon, who was studying the positions with the cameraman, hurried over when he saw Eric appear. "Eric, we'll start shooting at 3. Are you sure there's no problem here?" As he said that, Joss Whedon glanced at Natasha Henstucker, who was standing next to Eric. His meaning couldn't be more obvious. Eric nodded with a smile. "Don't worry, Joss. It would be strange if he didn't worry." Joss Whedon cursed inwardly, but there was nothing else he could do now. He could only say, "Then you guys go do your makeup first." With that, Joss Whedon gave an order to the director's assistant next to him. The assistant gestured to Eric and Natasha and led them to a makeup trailer. Larry Ellison was already sitting in front of the makeup table, allowing the makeup artist to fix his hair. When he saw Eric and Natasha, he turned his head and greeted them excitedly. However, When he saw the makeup artist raise his tools in a panic in the mirror in front of him, he quickly stiffened. Only Eric, Ellison, and Natasha needed to do their hair for this scene. Eric also smiled and sat down next to Larry Ellison. Natasha went to a cubicle in the trailer, which was the women's makeup area. She still had to change later. Ellison and Natasha's styles were very simple. Eric had to stick a beard on, which was a little more cumbersome. After Larry Ellison fixed his hair, he left the trailer in a black bodyguard suit. A moment later, Natasha came out in her professional suit and stood behind Eric with a smile. Looking at Eric's Tony Stark look, she realized that Eric seemed to have transformed into a different person with just a slight hairstyle change and a beard. Looking at the girl standing behind him in the mirror, Eric suddenly said, "Miss Brown, do you think I'm even more handsome now?" Having been trained countless times in the past 2 days, Natasha Henstucker reflexively entered Kristen Everhart mode when she heard the familiar tone and title. She retorted, "Mr. Stark, I've always felt that only superficial men care about their looks." "Well, it seems that today is your lucky day, because you've run into an exception." "Oh, why am I not surprised at all?" "You just haven't realized it yet. How about this? Let's have dinner together later and have a good chat. Then you'll know what kind of person I am." Listening to this strange conversation, the two makeup artists standing next to Eric couldn't help but twitch their lips at the same time. They looked at each other strangely, then pretended to be deaf and mute, and continued to bury themselves in their work. Eric and Natasha's conversation didn't continue because the door of the trailer was pushed open and Carolyn and Melanie, who were carefully carrying a suit, walked in together. Seeing Natasha standing behind Eric, Carolyn politely greeted her, while Melanie just nodded slightly. Natasha greeted the two of them and walked out. She could feel that Eric's attitude towards her two female assistants, especially the petite girl named Carolyn, was very special. Although she wanted to build a good relationship with them, the two women obviously didn't like her very much. Naturally, she wouldn't ask for a snub, so she took the initiative to avoid them. After chatting casually with Carolyn and Melanie for a while, the makeup artist finished the styling. Eric took the suit from Carolyn and walked into the inner room to change. Speaking of which, it was interesting that this custom-made Italian suit worth $50,000 was rented. As a top billionaire, the crew naturally wouldn't make any mistakes in his dressing and styling. All the suits Eric wore in the film were high-end custom-made from several major luxury brands, and this chiton suit was one of the cheaper ones. Moreover, what was more interesting was that these suits were actually Eric's own. In other words, the crew spent money to rent Eric's own suit for the male lead. In the future, when they filmed the interior scenes of Tony Stark's mansion, the sky-high furniture, which could easily cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, would also be moved from the Sharp Corner Manor. If the crew was short of money, Eric naturally wouldn't be stingy with his own clothes and props. However, the cost of renting luxury goods had actually been included in the film's budget long ago. The crew had originally planned to rent high-end clothes and related props during the filming, but when they thought about how he would have to wear second-hand clothes that he didn't know who had worn before, no matter how expensive they were, Eric felt uncomfortable all over. So things evolved into the current situation. Naturally, Eric didn't care about the money, but he was very concerned about maintaining this professional attitude of separating public from private interests. After changing clothes and leaving the trailer, the preparations for the start of the shoot were already done. Holding a script in his hand, Joss Whedon kept gesturing, as if he were teaching a child how to walk, and very carefully guided Natasha Henstridge's movements. When he saw Eric come out, he hurried over to talk to him. After Eric, Larry Ellison and a few background bodyguards were officially in position, he picked up the walkie-talkie and instructed all the departments to get ready for the shoot, while he himself quickly went behind the monitor. After a series of reports came from the walkie-talkie, Joss Whedon made an okay gesture to his assistant director, who picked up a loudspeaker and shouted to the entire square, "All departments, attention! Action!" As soon as he finished speaking, Eric walked to his car, escorted by a few background bodyguards. Then Natasha Henstridge, who was waiting next to the sculpture, entered the camera. This was a scene that had been shot in one go. Perhaps later on, Some scenes would be selected from some source material to be spliced together, but at this time, Joss Whedon didn't intend to break it down. After Natasha appeared, Joss Whedon immediately looked at another camera. 2 bodyguards stopped Natasha, and the girl leaned forward slightly to introduce herself. Joss Whedon nodded slightly. So far, Natasha Henstridge's performance was not bad. At least, it seemed to be much better than he had imagined. However, he also knew that the interaction between the two of them would be the highlight and the difficulty of this performance, so he continued to watch patiently. Kristen Everhart was stopped by the bodyguards. Larry Ellison, as Happy Hogan, raised his eyebrows and told Tony Stark in a low voice that she was a pretty girl. Only then did Stark seem to have just heard the girl's voice. He turned around with a pretentious smile and gestured for the bodyguards to let her pass. Joss Whedon immediately looked at another camera. In his heart, he had already sentenced this series of scenes to death. Larry Ellison's expression just now had been a little exaggerated. While Eric's reaction was in line with Tony Stark's personality, it wasn't perfect either. Even in terms of technology, there were too many things that could be improved in this series of scenes. However, Joss Whedon didn't shout cut. He hadn't expected to be able to pass it in one take anyway. At the same time, he also wanted to see how Natasha Henstridge would perform. On the monitor screen, Natasha Henstridge raised the recording pen in front of Eric, crossed her arms, and said with a natural smile on her face, "Mr. Stark, some people say that you're the modern Da Vinci. What do you think?" There was an obvious sense of superiority in Eric's tone as he said disdainfully, "That's ridiculous. I don't draw." "What about your other nickname?" Natasha Henstridge said, her sly smile gradually disappearing. There was a questioning and provocative look on her face, as she slowly uttered a few words. "Merchant of Death." Behind the monitor, Joss Whedon, who hadn't paid much attention to Eric's performance and had been staring at Natasha Henstridge, suddenly raised his eyebrows in surprise when he saw the girl's skillful series of micro-expression changes when she said this line. In just one short sentence, the rookie actress, who had acted in a movie for the first time, was actually able to clearly show the psychological changes in the character. This was definitely far beyond Joss Whedon's expectations. Recalling the audition tape of Natasha Henstridge that he had seen, Joss Whedon suddenly had a thought. Perhaps, in the past 2 days, Eric had really given this beautiful woman special treatment in private. As the scene on the monitor continued, the feeling of sparks flying between the two gradually increased Joss Whedon's surprise. Judging from Natasha Henstridge's current performance, this was definitely more than just special treatment. Chapter 968. Joss Whedon was so surprised by Natasha Henstridge's sudden burst of acting that he even forgot to call for cut at the end of the scene. What was even more surprising was that Joss Whedon's small mistake did not affect Eric and Natasha Henstridge's performance at all. The two of them did not hear the stop call, and naturally began to act freely, continuing with their lines. It was not until Eric and Natasha got into the black Rolls-Royce and the car started that Joss Whedon finally reacted. He quickly got up and gestured, personally shouting to the set, "Okay, cut." The door of the Rolls-Royce was pushed open again, and Eric, Natasha, and Larry Ellison got out of the car. Looking at Joss Whedon, who came up to them, Eric asked with a smile, "Joss, how was it just now?" Joss Whedon glanced at Natasha Henstridge, who was next to Eric, and remembered his initial doubts about this beautiful woman. He was a little embarrassed, but he was not stingy with his praise. "Very good, everyone did a great job, especially Miss Henstridge. It's hard to imagine that this is your first time appearing in front of a movie camera." "Oh, thank you for your affirmation, Joss." When Natasha Henstridge heard Joss Whedon's praise, her originally nervous mood suddenly calmed down, and she became a little excited. She glanced at the man next to her and said, "This is the result of Eric's help." Seeing that Joss Whedon had focused his attention on Natasha Henstridge, Larry Ellison asked somewhat anxiously, "Joss, what about me?" "That's what I wanted to say. Larry, Eric, Natasha, let's go over there and talk. There are many details that can be improved." Joss Whedon pointed at the monitor and led the three of them over. It took 7 to 8 minutes for Joss Whedon to analyze the performance details that needed to be adjusted for the three of them according to the scene just now. Then, he made adjustments to the technical problems that occurred during the first shoot. When they started shooting again, it was already half an hour later. However, because Natasha Henstucker, the unstable factor, that was most likely to affect the shooting, performed beyond expectations, the subsequent shooting went exceptionally smoothly. It was just after 5 o'clock. After Joss Whedon repeatedly checked a few of the more perfect materials, he announced the end of the set of outdoor scenes with relief. The crew began to quickly clean up the scene and prepare to evacuate, and at the same time, prepare for the shooting inside the casino at 6 o'clock. They originally thought that they would not have time to eat until 9 o'clock. The crew had also prepared some snacks such as chocolates for the actors to replenish their energy. Now that they had finished filming ahead of time, everyone naturally took advantage of this time to eat something. As they often had to be in a state of excitement, filming was still very energy-consuming. Although it was not yet daybreak, the chef had already prepared to serve them a sumptuous breakfast ins. Although it was not yet dawn the chef had already prepared a sumptuous breakfast. And the others when they arrived at the restaurant to have breakfast. Although it was not to the day the restaurant had to were to had twos was twos, the two naturally he had of. After 3, the Veto shoots. Shoot to shoot. Natasha Henstquist waited until 9 o'clock on the set before returning to the mansion in the country club with Eric. Eric, didn't I do great today? As soon as they entered the door, Natasha Henstquist enthusiastically pressed Eric against the door and asked expectantly, "Of course you scared Joss?" Eric nodded and felt the girl gently rubbing her long legs on his body. He smiled and held up a folder that Carolyn had handed to him. "You haven't slept for almost a day and a night. Go take a shower and rest. I have to finish reading these first." Natasha Henstquist leaned over to Eric's ear and breathed hot air. "Let's do it together. Can't we do it later?" Eric patted the girls' butt and shook his head. "Of course not. Someone in Europe is still waiting for me to finish reading the reply. This is yesterday's work. Then I'll watch it with you." Natasha Henstquist let go of Eric and took his arm. Since last night, Natasha had been in a state of excitement. Although the scenes in Las Vegas had been completed, she was still not tired at all. The two went to the spacious living room on the second floor. Eric sat down on the sofa and said, "If you're not sleepy, go to the study and get me my laptop and make a pot of coffee." "Yes, sir," Natasha replied. She got up and ran to the study to get Eric's laptop. Then she ran downstairs to boil water and make coffee. Eric opened the laptop and put it on the coffee table. Then he opened the documents in his hands. The documents in his hands were the draft of Firefly Group's acquisition of Viking Records and the balance sheet of Viking Records. Firefly offered the final price of $1.2 billion to EMI Group. As Eric expected, EMI Group did not intend to hold Viking Records in their hands. In the end, they accepted Firefly's offer. During the 2 months of long negotiations, a lot of work had been completed ahead of time. The focus of the two sides' wrangling had always been on the transaction price. With the intention reached, the two companies had no intention of continuing to delay anything. Barry Weiss flew to Europe in a hurry yesterday, and Eric received the information in his hands last night. With the acquisition of Viking Records, coupled with the group's existing North American record distribution channels, Firefly Records' distribution network would completely cover the entire European and American region. At the same time, as a veteran record company that had been established for more than 20 years, Viking Records had accumulated tens of thousands of song copyrights over the years. In addition to mainstream English songs, there were also French, German, Italian, and other European languages. The number of music copyrights was naturally incomparable to the major record labels with millions of song copyright reserves, but it was a good content supplement for the Yahoo Music store that was about to open in Europe with the release of Firefly 2. The Spice Girls, who had become popular in Europe through several consecutive singles, would also quickly spread their first record with the help of Viking Records' perfect record distribution channels in Europe. Natasha Henstucker made coffee and brought it upstairs. She poured 2 cups and placed them on the coffee table. Then, she found a magazine from the shelf under the coffee table and leaned comfortably next to Eric. She consciously did not express any curiosity about the information in Eric's hands. She just asked, "Eric, are we going back to Los Angeles with the crew in the afternoon?" Eric turned a page of the document in his hand and said casually, "No, we'll go back tomorrow morning. I'll take you out to play in the evening. How about that?" "Okay, although I've been to Las Vegas before, it was basically for work. I haven't had a good time yet." Natasha Henstucker nodded. She paused and said, "Eric, the Academy Awards ceremony is next Monday. Are you going this time?" "I have to go this time. This year is the 70th anniversary of the Oscars." Eric smiled and glanced at the girl next to him. He said, "You want to go too?" Natasha nodded honestly. "I can't help it this time. The ceremony is next week and all the guest lists have been confirmed. However, attending the Oscars doesn't feel good at all. Think about it. Sitting in a seat for 3 hours without moving, with cameras, guests and so on. Eric, the Oscars may not matter to you anymore." Natasha's expression was a little longing, but she was very honest. "However, for small fries like us, it's an honor to be able to attend the Oscars. If you really want to go, I'll help you get in touch next year and serve as an award guest or something. But you have to remember to remind me next year. Otherwise, I'll forget." Natasha threw away the magazine in her hand, bent her legs, and looked at Eric sideways. She smiled and said, "Your tone is really discouraging. However, I suddenly feel that I should work hard for these opportunities myself." Eric used a pencil to make a mark on a deal clause that he felt was not very reasonable. He continued to read and nodded at the same time. "Very good. I like girls who are motivated. But Paulina said that according to our qualifications, we won't be able to achieve anything in Hollywood. We can only act as vases. She has acted as a vase several times before and didn't have any impact in Hollywood at all. A few days ago, a friend of hers asked her to make a guest appearance in a film, but she refused." "Paulina Pliskova?" "Yes. Oh, her face is too perfect. She can only act in commercials, but you're different." Natasha Henstridge gently nudged Eric's leg with her knee. With a little dissatisfaction, she smiled and said, "You mean I'm not perfect enough? You vixens are envied by so many people. There's no need to pursue perfection. What's more, perfection means the loss of plasticity, and this is the most important point for actors. When I see Paulina, I only want to take her to shoot commercials. But when I see you, it's different. I can knead you and put you in the movie as a big vase." Then, Natasha's tone suddenly had a little more cautious and expectant. "Eric, do you think I can be the female lead?" "Yes, according to your performance in Iron Man, when the movie is released next year, you'll definitely gain a lot of recognition and corresponding fame. At that time, it's unlikely that you can become the female lead in a big-budget movie overnight. You need opportunities, but it's still easy to get the female lead in a few low-budget movies in Hollywood." As Eric spoke, he once again thought of Alien, which was going to be released during Easter next month. Natasha had originally relied on her stunning performance in this B-grade sci-fi horror series to gain a foothold in Hollywood. Although she had never been a big hit, she was still a B-grade actress with some fame. Speaking of which, in Hollywood, it was indeed a good choice for a beautiful actress to have a long-lasting B-grade movie series if she wanted to maintain her influence for a long time. Just like Mira Jovovich's Resident Evil series, Kate Beckinsale's Legend of the Night series, and so on. Resident Evil had been changed into a different look by Eric, but Legend of the Night was still there. Thinking of this, Eric immediately looked up at the girl next to him. "Natasha, stand up and let me take a look." Natasha did not know what was going on, but she obediently stood up and skillfully struck a pose. She asked, "What's wrong?" Eric did not answer. He continued, "Make a cold expression and look more dispirited." Natasha finally realized something and immediately cooperated with a dispirited and cold expression. If she was asked to act immediately, she might not be able to do it perfectly. However, as a supermodel, She was very skilled in dealing with this kind of request, which was similar to a print ad. Eric looked her up and down. The girl was wearing a white turtleneck sweater and light blue casual pants. Although her expression was on point, she did not have the temperament that Eric needed at all. So he asked again, "Do you have a leather jacket?" Natasha said, "I brought a pair of leather pants. They're burgundy. Is that okay?" "No, I want black." Eric shook his head and said, "How about this, you drive out now and buy a set? I'll also finish looking at these things in my hands. When you come back, I'll give you a surprise." Although she had already guessed it, Natasha still asked, "Eric, is it a movie?" Eric nodded. "Uh-huh. Then I'll go now." Natasha nodded excitedly. She put on her high heels, leaned over and kissed Eric on the lips. Then she walked downstairs. After Natasha left, Eric focused on reading the several documents in his hands. He wrote down any questions he had and emailed them to Barry Weiss in Europe. Then he picked out a website from the browser on his laptop and opened it. A simple Google search page immediately appeared on the page. The familiar Google logo was designed by Eric himself. It was exactly the same as the original. After the video conference at the end of last year, Yahoo immediately began to separate the search engine. Now, not only had Yahoo registered the Google trademark worldwide in advance, but the separate search engine system had also basically been completed. It was currently in the closed beta stage, and was expected to be officially opened in June this year. Since there was no more Alien series, and with Kate Beckinsale's current status, it was impossible for her to act in Legend of the Night again. Therefore, it was a good choice to give the series to Natasha Henstucker. Natasha's appearance and figure were not inferior to Kate's. As for her acting skills, well, this movie did not seem to require any acting skills. However, in order to film Legend of the Night, she had to obtain the copyright first. The original script of Legend of the Night series, the director and screenwriter Alan Wiseman, claimed that a few of his friends worked together to create it. However, in fact, it was plagiarized from a 1994 novel. The two parties fought a lawsuit and finally settled out of court. 10 years had passed, and the complete memories of his previous life inevitably began to fade bit by bit. Eric racked his brain for a while before he remembered the name of the author of the original novel, Nancy Collins, and hurriedly searched for it. In fact, even if he did not remember, Eric did not have much of a burden. He planned to use it directly. At worst, he would settle it out of court. Over the years, Eric was no longer worried that his ideas would clash with the original authors. This was because there were too many such lawsuits in Hollywood. Any director with a little fame, whether it was Spielberg or Martin Scorsese, had basically been sued for their scripts. Eric had never seen a Hollywood director go bankrupt or lose his reputation because of this. Chapter 969. Eric quickly found a short story collection signed by Nancy Collins on Amazon. After reading the introduction, the idea of Legend of the Night obviously came from a novel called Love of Monsters. Natasha was not back yet, so Eric called the girl's cell phone and asked her to go to the bookstore and buy the book. "Eric, is this the book?" After another half an hour, Natasha handed a book that was not too thick to Eric. "I went to 3 bookstores before I found it." Eric looked at the cover and nodded. "This is the book. Did you buy the leather jacket? Let me take a look first." Natasha shook the handbags in her hand and walked to the bedroom. After Natasha left, Eric leaned on the sofa and opened the book to read Love of Monsters, which was only 7 or 8 pages long. This was a story similar to Romeo and Juliet. A werewolf and a vampire were in love, but because the two races had been mortal enemies for generations, they could not be together under the obstruction of their clansmen. In the end, they both committed suicide. After reading the novel, Eric was about to write an email to the copyright department of Firefly to get the adaptation rights of this novel, when he heard the sound of leather boots knocking on the ground. Looking up, Natasha Henstucker, who was wearing a black leather jacket and a pair of black mountain boots, walked in. The tight leather jacket outlined the girl's perfect figure, even more curvaceous. The simple ponytail and the high-top mountain boots on her feet also added a bit of valiance to her. However, Eric glanced at the black leather belt in Natasha's hand, a little scared. "What are you doing?" Natasha raised the leather belt in her hand and patted it twice in her other hand. With a cold and arrogant look on her face, she walked over and pushed Eric to the back of the sofa. She straddled him and lowered her head. Eric sucked in a breath of cold air as he felt a small, warm tongue slowly glide across his neck, all the way up. He shouted, "Stop!" Natasha Henstucker stopped and looked up at Eric. Finally she laughed. "I thought you would like this." Eric shook his head firmly. "No, I don't like it at all. If you dare to continue, I'll kick you out. Here, take off this ponytail first." Natasha did not get off Eric. She made a face, threw away the belt in her hand, and untied her ponytail. She shook her head a few times, and her blonde hair fell down. A soft and charming aura suddenly offset her neutral temperament. "Is this okay?" "Yes, very good." Eric nodded and carefully admired the beauty close to him. He said, "That's it. I just called the restaurant in the club and made a reservation. Let's go have lunch first, and I'll tell you about the movie." Natasha looked excited. She wrapped her arms around Eric's neck. "Does that mean I've passed the audition?" Eric nodded. "As long as you dye your hair, you'll look good and your acting skills will pass. As for the rest, as long as you're not afraid of hard work in the future, this movie will be yours." "Why will it be hard? Will there be a lot of fighting scenes, like in Whopping Beauty?" "More or less. You're the only female lead, and the action scenes should be more than the three of them. So, I need you to undergo a few months of physical training in advance." "Of course, no problem." Natasha nodded quickly and pretended to get up. "Then I'll go change first." Eric smiled and stopped her. "No, just wear this to the restaurant." "Haha, you don't like it, do you?" "If I didn't like it, would I let you buy this set of clothes?" "Then, don't ask so many questions." "Oh." After 3 days of work on Monday, the crew returned to Los Angeles that afternoon. Next was the scene at the Disney Theater in Los Angeles. It was also a night shoot, so there was no work during the day on Thursday. Eric returned to Los Angeles the next morning with Natasha Henstucker. After a week of work, the crew did not work overtime this weekend. The next Monday, March 23rd, was the 70th Oscar Awards ceremony. Eric had received an invitation call from the chairman of the Academy 2 months in advance. In addition, it was the 70th birthday of the Oscars, so it was naturally inappropriate for him to be absent this time. Therefore, he agreed and even agreed to be the guest presenter for the Best Screenplay award. However, in between filming Iron Man, Eric was most concerned about this year's Easter schedule. It was already late March, and this year's Easter was on April 12th. The Easter schedule usually started a week earlier, which was April 3rd. Firefly, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, and Fox's joint Easter marketing plan had entered the final stage. Now, whether it was in theaters, on street billboards, or during commercial breaks on several major television networks, posters and remix previews of The Wedding Singer, Alien, and Trump Card Spy could be seen frequently. The three film companies had completely bundled the three movies together. For this, the advertising and marketing budget alone was a total of $50 million. This budget was even larger than that of a blockbuster movie with a production cost of more than $100 million, because the total marketing and distribution budget of a typical blockbuster was less than $50 million. The production cost of the three movies added up to $83 million. Speaking of which, there was originally a film that was hoped to be included in this Easter movie package, which was City of Angels, produced by Warner Brothers. This fantasy romance film, starring Nicolas Cage and Meg Ryan, had a production cost of $55 million due to the participation of two A-list big names. Warner Brothers was also confident that this film would be a blockbuster during the Easter season. Therefore, when Firefly proposed the bundled promotion, although the management of Warner Brothers was very interested in cooperating, because City of Angels was an entire order of magnitude higher than the other three movies, the other party inevitably put forward a series of conditions that leaned towards City of Angels. Because of the many internal problems, Warner Brothers' efficiency was appallingly low. Eric felt that if they really waited for these conditions to be negotiated, Easter might be long over, so they had to give up and play their own game. In fact, even within the three companies, there were their own concerns about this cooperation. The biggest disagreement was how to share the $50 million marketing budget. Some wanted to share it equally, while others wanted to share it according to the budget cost. Eric naturally did not want these differences to affect this cooperation, so he personally came forward and made the final decision with a firm attitude. The distribution would be based on the final box office of the three movies in North America. In the future, the ones with the highest box office would receive more, and the ones with the lowest box office would receive less. This way, no one would feel that they were at a disadvantage. The Wedding Singer, Alien, and Ace of Spies focused on warm romance, sci-fi thriller, and vulgar comedy respectively. They also released discounted holiday packages. With a marketing budget of $50 million, the effect was very obvious with the fresh gimmick and the overwhelming publicity and marketing. After the feedback from the survey, most of the potential audience groups already knew about the existence of these three movies. More than 80% of the fans surveyed said that they might choose one or a few of the movies to watch in theaters, depending on the situation. In comparison, although Warner Bros.' City of Angels also invested $25 million in marketing budget, its momentum was far inferior to Firefly's Easter movie package. Although the box office appeal of Nicolas Cage and Meg Ryan was strong, on Firefly's side, Mike Myers of Ace of Spies and Ben Stiller of The Wedding Singer were both ace comedians from Saturday Night Live and were well known in the United States. Jennifer Aniston, the female lead of The Wedding Singer, had accumulated 200 episodes of Friends for nearly 10 years. Her position as the #1 sweetheart in the United States was unshakable. Even Heather Graham, the female lead of Alien, had been a sexy goddess in the hearts of many fans since her debut in the 80s. Therefore, the combined popularity of these people was not inferior to Cage and Meg Ryan at all. Even in terms of marketing, these people's advantage was far superior to Cage and Meg Ryan's. Just like TV shows, Cage and Meg Ryan could only follow Warner Bros. Arrangements and appear on a few popular talk shows. But the group of four here was much more imaginative. Saturday Night Live was definitely not going away. The four of them took turns to watch it. Late Show with David Letterman, The Jay Leno Show, and so on. With their connections in the TV industry, even if Firefly didn't arrange it, it was easy to get them on. Even the second half of Friends, which had returned after the winter break, specially arranged a crossover episode related to these movies. Mike Myers, Ben Stiller, and Heather Graham would all appear as guests. After careful consideration, Ace of Spies would be released on April 3rd at the same time as Warner Bros.' City of Angels. Alien and The Wedding Singer were scheduled for April 10th, the week of Easter. Due to the huge marketing campaign, although the three movies were not blockbusters, the major theaters in North America were very enthusiastic about the scheduling of the three movies. The screens of the three movies all reached about 3,000, which was already a treatment that only big productions could get. Of course, the reason why they were able to get so many screens was because Easter wasn't a popular time period yet. Chapter 970. Most of the members of the Iron Man crew were off on the weekend, but Eric could not relax at all. Firefly's only blockbuster this summer, The Day After Tomorrow, had already released a trailer at the Super Bowl in January. However, the film had only recently completed its final cut and was about to be submitted for review, and a TV trailer was released. Eric took the time to watch the film with Katzenberg and the others. In addition, he also checked the production progress of several projects such as Ring, Teddy Bear, Decapitation Valley, and even the Lord of the Rings trilogy filmed in New Zealand. Ring had already started filming and was expected to be released smoothly during the summer. The casting of Teddy Bear had also been completed, and the motion capture technology that required a lot of use was being tested. Decapitation Valley had just completed its budget plan and was about to enter the casting and filming stage. After the success of Monster Power Company at the end of last year, Disney's animation department had been preparing a new script for the past few months. Katzenberg and some of Disney's old officials hoped to continue the tradition of Disney's fairy tale feature films. Eric did not want Disney's animation studio to become another Pixar. What's more, Disney had already proven the correctness of this path in the original space-time. Naturally, he would not object to the proposal of Katzenberg and the others. Therefore, among the several ideas provided by the studio's management, Eric, Katzenberg, and the others chose Rapunzel after discussion. As for the explosive Frozen, Eric still hoped that the studio would continue to hone through one or two projects before taking it out. The original version of Rapunzel was seriously out of control due to changes in the script and upheaval among the top management. The production cycle dragged on for 6 years and burned through $260 million of Disney, making it the most expensive 3D animated film in history. In order to avoid repeating the same mistakes as much as possible, although Disney's animation studio had already come up with a very detailed script, Eric still asked them to use 3 more months to polish the script in detail, to ensure that the same situation would not happen after the project was launched. As for the Lord of the Rings trilogy, which was being filmed in New Zealand, Eric could only watch a batch of samples that the crew had flown over and hold a remote video conference with Peter Jackson. Katzenberg had flown to New Zealand twice in the past few months, and a vice president of Firefly Pictures was one of the producers of The Lord of the Rings, and was based in Australia. In addition, Peter Jackson was very focused on the Lord of the Rings series, so Eric was very assured about this project. After working for 2 days, Eric finally regretted acting in Iron Man himself. This work could have been done a little bit on weekdays, but it was concentrated in these 2 days, and it was still during the weekend break. Moreover, this was because Eric was completely hands-off in many matters. This year, Eric personally decided that the only movies that would be released within the year were The Day After Tomorrow, Teddy Bear, and Ring. With Firefly Corporation's huge film production and distribution system, it was naturally impossible for them to only have these 3 movies. Not counting the 2 animation studios with long project cycles, Firefly Pictures, Disney Pictures, and New Line Cinema, as the main film production companies of Firefly Group, had confirmed more than 20 films released within the year this year. Although Eric rarely directly intervened in the production of these projects in the past, most of the projects, even if it was an ultra-low-cost film with a budget of 2 to 3 million yuan, he actually knew the information about the genre, budget, production, schedule, or box office prospects. But this year, Iron Man in the first half of the year and Gravity in the second half of the year would take up most of his energy. It was impossible for Eric to do this again. The energy that Eric could spare for the group's other businesses other than movies was also pitifully little. As for some of the MGM and Fox movies, Eric didn't have the energy to care about them anymore. As for Firefly investment, Eric only paid some attention to Yahoo and left the rest to Chris. Eric, this is the first draft of the second Harry Potter book that has just been sent over from the UK. HarperCollins Publishing hopes that the second book will be released during the summer vacation. It was already Sunday afternoon at Firefly's Burbank headquarters. Carolyn knocked on the door and came in, putting a sample book on his desk. Eric signed a budget document for the Firefly theme park. Only then did he raise his head and take the book. He inadvertently glanced at Carolyn, who immediately panicked and hurriedly moved away. "Did you do something wrong recently?" Eric asked casually without looking up as he flipped open the book's contents page. He didn't know what was wrong with this girl. Every time she saw him, she had a guilty look on her face. Hearing Eric's sudden question, Carolyn subconsciously took a step back and shook her head. No. Well, it's okay. I forgive you. So don't be like this anymore. Work hard, or I'll deduct your salary." Hearing Eric's gentle and teasing tone, Carolyn's bright eyes quickly blinked a few times. She resisted the urge to nod and agree. Seeing that Eric still didn't look up at her, she didn't run away. After flipping through a few pages, Eric closed the book and looked up at Carolyn. "How many copies of the first Harry Potter book sold?" Carolyn answered accurately without thinking. The global sales statistics for last week were 13.5 million copies. Eric nodded with satisfaction. Although the Harry Potter series still hadn't reached its peak, with the promotion of the Firefly Group, the global sales had reached 13.5 million since the first book was released in September last year. This was absolutely a miracle. When HarperCollins wants to release the second book is up to them. As long as they maintain the speed of one book a year, it's fine. Eric pushed the novel draft to Carolyn and said, "In addition, make 3 copies of this novel and send them to East Hampton. The little guys like this story very much." "Okay." Carolyn nodded and held the first draft in her arms. She said, "Also, New Line just sent me an email. They have already negotiated with Chris Tucker about the salary for Rush Hour 3. It's $20 million US. Jack Chung still wants to get a share of the profits based on the salary." Eric waved his hand. "I don't care about this matter. Let them talk about it. If they want a share, the base salary can't exceed $10 million US. This is Firefly's rule. If they can't reach an agreement, then don't shoot. Okay." Carolyn nodded and continued. "In addition, the copyright department has already contacted Nancy Collins's agent for the adaptation rights of the short story, Love of Monsters. They are willing to sell it. However, we can only get the film adaptation rights. The other party has already sold the game adaptation rights to the White Wolf Game Company in advance. The copyright department sent an email asking if we need to take back the game adaptation rights. The White Wolf Game Company hasn't started to make the game adaptation of this novel. As long as the price is right, they should be willing to sell it." Since 1993, the annual output of the world's video game industry had been comparable to the movie industry. Movie adaptation games were also more and more important to the movie industry. Firefly also had an entertainment interactive department that produced video games. However, Eric wasn't optimistic about the prospects of this department at all. The production of video games and movies had many similarities. They were both fields where creativity was paramount. An excellent video game couldn't be separated from the creative core creator, just like the director and producer of a movie. The Entertainment Interactive Department hired a group of programmers to develop a game according to the software development process. It was like asking a group of pure technical staff such as cameramen and lighting engineers to make a movie. The possibility of producing a good product was very low. Therefore, before the advent of the online game era, Eric didn't plan to get too involved in the video game industry. Even if online games appeared in the next few years, Eric was more inclined to use Yahoo's huge user base to act as a game agent. As for online game production, the studio model was still the best way. Of course, Yahoo could also use the investment or acquisition model to obtain the actual control of these studios. Eric shook his head and said, "No need, as long as we get the film adaptation rights. Is there anything else?" Over the past few days, Melanie had instigated her to invite Eric for a meal more than once. However, Carolyn knew how busy Eric was over the past 2 days. Clearly, this wasn't an appropriate time. Moreover, Eric already had plans for tonight. Carolyn quickly found a reasonable excuse in her heart. She hesitated for a bit before she shook her head and said, "No." Eric looked at his watch and said, "Then you and May can get off work early. It's the weekend, so you can play a bit more. I'm about to get off work too." Tomorrow was the Oscars. Eric was going to the Oscars party tonight. He wasn't going to have fun, but he wanted to take the opportunity to talk to Harvey Wayne and Stan about FFM TV station. Half a month ago, the second season of Hey Dow Clan officially aired. The first episode of the second season had a viewership of 5.16 million, which was more than double the average viewership of the first season. It even broke the viewership record of the pay TV channel. With the popularity of Machida and other original series and movies released by FFM TV station, the total number of FFM TV station subscribers successfully broke the 10 million mark. Compared to last year when Machida aired, it achieved a 120% increase. Since the Firefly system didn't have a cable operating system like Warner Cable, FFM TV station's subscriber growth rate would definitely slow down. FFM TV station would also need to make appropriate adjustments to their operating strategy. After Carolyn left, Eric flipped through a few more documents. It was already 5 o'clock in the afternoon. Eric looked at the pile of documents waiting to be processed. He could only give up. Although the Oscars would be held tomorrow, the filming of Iron Man would still continue. However, Eric didn't have any scenes. He could still work a few hours during the day. After leaving the Burbank headquarters, the car drove along the mountain road to Elizabeth and Julia's Beverly Hills mansion. Julia went to Paris to shoot a commercial, so she wouldn't be attending the Oscars tomorrow. Only Elizabeth was in the mansion. She was wearing a dress with the help of 2 stylists. Eric walked into the mansion and looked at the 3 people in the living room. He nodded and leaned comfortably on the sofa. "Eric, what do you think of this dress?" After a while, Elizabeth lifted the hem of her red one-shoulder dress and walked over. She twirled in a circle and asked. Eric had always liked one-shoulder dresses. He always felt that this dress had an inexplicable sense of playfulness and sexiness. The women around him seemed to gradually realize this preference. Eric looked up and down and nodded. He looked at the dress that almost reached the ground and said, "It's beautiful. But tonight is a party, not an award ceremony. Aren't you afraid of tripping? You haven't worn high heels yet. You won't be like this if you wear high heels." Elizabeth lifted her skirt again, revealing her fair feet. Then, she pointed at the 2 big boxes on the coffee table in the living room and said, "Oh right, I also ordered a suit for you. There are also leather shoes. Hurry up and try them on. Lisa is here. If you don't fit, you can change it." "I'm too tired. I don't want to change. I plan to wear this." Eric leaned on the sofa again. He did not want to be tormented again. He said, "Also, I'm hungry. If I don't eat, I'll faint due to hypoglycemia. You decide." Seeing Eric's shameless look, Elizabeth kicked him lightly in the leg in annoyance. She bent down to pull off his leather boots and threw them away. She said in a crafty tone, "Hurry up and change. If it weren't for you, I wouldn't be bothered to dress so formally." Eric lifted his leg and said, "Why don't you help me put it on?" "In your dreams." Elizabeth rolled her eyes at him. She walked back to the 2 stylists who saw this scene but were trying to pretend that they did not exist. She asked them to help her tidy up the dress. Eric felt Elizabeth's threatening gaze for a while. He had no choice but to get up and carry the 2 boxes of clothes and shoes upstairs to the bedroom. After changing, he went downstairs. The 2 stylists had already started to do Elizabeth's hair. It was basically impossible for a woman to dress without at least 1 or 2 hours. The 2 of them finally left the mansion at the top of Beverly Hills at 6:30 p.m. Although Elizabeth did not plan to eat dinner, she did not want Eric to starve with her. She first went to a restaurant and accompanied Eric to eat something. The 2 of them then rushed to the venue of the Oscar party at 7:00 p.m. Chapter 971. The car stopped outside the Hilton Hotel. Eric and Elizabeth walked into the hotel under the intense spotlights and escorted by bodyguards and hotel security. As soon as they arrived at the hotel lobby, Eric heard a warm greeting. "Eric, I didn't expect you to come tonight." Looking in the direction of the voice, it was Nicolas Cage. Beside Cage was Hollywood actress Meg Ryan and another tall black man. It seemed that the 3 of them had just been chatting. As the black man turned around, Eric recognized him as Richard Parsons, one of the few African executives in Hollywood. Richard Parsons was currently the vice president of Time Warner and the CEO of Warner Brothers Production Company. Seeing the 3 of them walking over, Eric greeted them with Elizabeth. "Good evening, Nick Richard. Oh, and Ms. Ryan. You are so beautiful tonight." Other than Cage, who had a good personal relationship with him, the other 2 were just acquaintances. After Elizabeth greeted the 3 of them, Eric asked, "So what were you guys talking about just now?" "We've just arrived," Cage said. He paused for a second and smiled without saying anything else. He just glanced at Richard Parsons discreetly. In fact, Cage, Meg Ryan, and the head of Warner Brothers were all gathered together at this time. It was obvious that they were talking about the Easter movie City of Angels. Richard Parsons had no intention of avoiding the topic. He laughed heartily and said, "We were just talking about the company's City of Angels. Eric, it's a pity that we couldn't cooperate with Firefly in the promotion of the movie. But you also know that within Warner Brothers, I don't have the final say on this kind of thing." "It's okay. There will always be opportunities to cooperate in the future." Eric shook his head with a regretful expression. After chatting for a while, Eric walked to the elevator with Elizabeth. Richard Parsons, who used the excuse that he had something else to do in the lobby, looked at Eric and Elizabeth as they left. He then smiled warmly and started chatting with Cage and Meg Ryan again. As soon as the elevator doors closed, Elizabeth asked in a gossipy tone, "Eric, do you think Terry Semel will be able to retain his position as Time Warner's CEO after his contract ends next year?" Eric was also lost in thought. When he heard Elizabeth's words, he shook his head and said, "It's unlikely." Over the past few years within Time Warner, there was a faction led by Terry Semel, who was left behind by the founder of Time Warner Corporation. Gerald Levin, who was at the helm of Time Warner Corporation in the early days, was another faction. Ted Turner, the founder of Turner Broadcasting Company, was another faction. In addition to a series of heavyweight shareholders who were brought in during the company's expansion and acquisition process, the entire Time Warner Corporation could be said to be filled with powerful individuals. As one of the designated successors of Steve Ross, Terry Semel still went through a power struggle before he became the chairman and CEO of Time Warner Group. However, over the past few years, Time Warner's performance had been lukewarm, and the influence left behind by Steve Ross was getting weaker and weaker. It was basically impossible for Terry Semel to continue to control Time Warner after this term ended. When he saw Richard Parsons, Eric vaguely remembered that during the world-shocking merger between Time Warner and AOL in his previous life, this name appeared in the news very frequently. According to Eric's understanding of Time Warner, Richard Parsons should be the backbone of Gerald Levin's faction. Although Eric had personally talked to Steve Cass a few times, he had never given up on his ambition to turn AOL into an internet media group. Chris had already begun to plot to seize control of AOL. On the other hand, if AOL wanted to acquire Time Warner, it would take more than one hand to clap. There would definitely be people within Time Warner who would take the initiative to facilitate this merger. Therefore, when he saw Richard Parsons, combined with the information in his memory, Eric could roughly determine which side supported this merger within Time Warner. Once Terry Semel stepped down, Steve Ross's influence over Time Warner would completely dissipate. Then, Ted Turner's faction, which controlled Time Warner's most profitable cable TV business, would become the most powerful force within Time Warner. Although Ted Turner had been in a semi-retired state for the past few years, and would not personally hold any positions within Time Warner, as long as he was willing, he would definitely be able to support the company's chairman and CEO who were inclined towards him. In comparison, the possibility of Gerald Levin's faction gaining control of Time Warner was very low. Therefore, if they were not willing to submit to others, they could only find another way. Facilitating the merger between AOL and Time Warner, these two giants would undoubtedly expand their own influence within Time Warner in a short period of time, thus gaining the support of a large number of voting minority shareholders. Of course, Steve Cass should still be privately looking for a merger target. Perhaps, this could create some obstacles for him in this regard. The sound of the elevator door opening pulled Eric back to reality from his thoughts. He smiled at the girl beside him, raised his arm to let Elizabeth hold him, and walked towards the banquet hall. This matter still needed to be carefully considered. However, the upcoming Easter might be a good opportunity to strike at the Levin faction within Time Warner. After all, although they did not cooperate with Firefly, the root cause was the result of the internal struggle within Time Warner. But the failure of the decision must be pinned on the person with the biggest responsibility. Richard Parsons, as the person directly in charge of Time Warner Brothers, was undoubtedly the best candidate to take the blame. Of course, to achieve this goal, there was a very important prerequisite, and that was the box office of Firefly's Easter movie package could clearly exceed Time Warner's City of Angels. Thinking of this, Eric could not help but shake his head regretfully. Although the three companies spared no effort in promoting the three movies, whether it was Ace Spy 2, Alien, or The Wedding Singer, although Eric did not remember the box office data of the three movies, they clearly did not have the potential to be a big hit. It seemed that he had to think of other ways. Eric refused to go to the media area to be photographed and interviewed. He took Elizabeth directly into the banquet hall. Eric and Elizabeth arrived relatively late, so the banquet hall was already overcrowded. Naturally, A social interaction was inevitable. However, Eric and Elizabeth were not the hosts. They just greeted a group of guests who took the initiative to come forward and greet them. The two walked towards the Wayne Stan brothers. "Eric, let me introduce you to a few people." After greeting them, Harvey Weinstein did not forget to introduce a few people around him to Eric one by one. The main ones were the main creators of The English Patient and Mindcatcher. Director Anthony Minghella of The English Patient, the male lead Ralph Fiennes, the two female leads, Kristen Scott Thomas and Juliette Binoche, and Mindcatcher's best friend Mata. Eric was naturally very familiar with these people, but it was the first time he had met most of them. Everyone chatted for a while. These people were all sophisticated. They realized that Eric and Harvey might have something to talk about, so they quickly dispersed. After everyone left, Elizabeth also ran to greet a best friend who was present. Eric took a sip of red wine in his hand. He was not in a hurry to talk about FFM TV station. He asked casually, "Harvey, how are the preparations for Horse Whisperer?" Harvey's expression was a little strange when he heard Eric mention this topic. Elizabeth had already talked to him about Fox's strategy for Miramax to develop an indie film with a budget of no more than $50 million. As a businessman, although Harvey agreed with this idea in his heart, he still inevitably felt conflicted about this decision. After all, Miramax's contribution to Fox's profits in the past few years had accounted for almost half of its film business. He naturally had the idea of continuing to develop Miramax. Robert will personally be the director and the male lead. Also, the female lead has been decided. It's Kristen. The other roles are currently being auditioned. It's expected to start shooting in May. The male and female leads had not changed. Thinking of the chance encounter a few days ago, Eric smiled. He just did not know if his daughter's role would still be Scarlett Johansson. He did not plan to get involved in this matter. He then chatted with Harvey about the next step of FFM TV station's development strategy. However, although Eric did not plan to get involved in the casting of Horse Whisperer, he could not stop things from taking the initiative to come to him. The next afternoon, at Firefly Studios. Although he was filming Iron Man, Eric did not stop preparing for Gravity. He had been in contact with the two leads of Gravity, Jodie Foster and George Clooney. They were going to attend the Academy Awards ceremony that night. Coincidentally, the Academy had arranged for Jodie Foster and Eric to be the guest presenters for the Best Screenplay Award. The two met up in advance, and in the afternoon, they went to the studio of Gravity at Firefly Studios to discuss the details of the film. Last year's Batman and Robin was a box office failure. George Clooney attached great importance to the opportunity to act in Gravity this time. When he heard the news, he also rushed over. The three of them were in the studio studying the shooting techniques for the opening long scene. Eric saw Melanie come in and say that Miranda Kerr had brought a friend to the studio. After saying goodbye to Jodie and George, Eric left the studio. When he saw Miranda Kerr and Scarlett Johansson next to her, Eric reached out and stopped the girl's little body. He said with a serious expression, "Hey, explain to me first. What day is it today? Don't you need to go to school?" "Scarlett is attending an audition for a movie today, so I went with her to ask for leave." Miranda was not afraid of Eric's fake serious expression at all. She wrapped her arms around his arm and said with a smile, "Also, don't think that I don't know. Drew often played truant from school, and you didn't do anything about it." Eric shook his head helplessly. He was not a qualified parent. He did not care much about his child playing truant. Instead of bringing the two girls into the studio of Gravity, Eric pointed in the direction of the administrative district and walked towards his office in the studio. He said, "Come with me. First, tell me, why are you here at this time?" Miranda Kerr looked at Scarlett Johansson, who was pretending to be a good girl. She shook Eric's arm and said, "Eric, it's like this. Can you help Scarlett say hello to Mr. Weinstein? She really wants the role in Horse Whisperer." Eric frowned and looked at Scarlett Johansson. He did not know who suggested this. "Who helped you with the audition? How was it?" "Mr. Weinstein and Mr. Redford personally presided over the audition today. They, said that my performance was very good." Eric asked, "What about the others?" Who else participated in the audition? Yes, I don't know the others. Scarlett Johansson shook her head and said, but one of them is Kirsten Dunst. She was nominated for the Golden Globe Award for Best Supporting Actress a few years ago. Eric nodded. He had a general understanding of the situation. According to Harvey's thinking, he would obviously prefer Kirsten Dunst, who had better acting skills. In this case, the possibility of Scarlett Johansson getting the role would be very low. Eric did not say anything else. He brought the two girls to his office and asked his secretary to make a few cups of coffee. Then, he leaned on the leather chair behind his desk and looked at the two girls who gradually became more reserved under his gaze. Eric had always been very indulgent towards the women around him, but this indulgence was definitely not without a bottom line. Among the women, Eric doted on Drew the most. Although it was somewhat inappropriate, he basically treated this girl as his daughter. Fortunately, this girl was smart enough to know what to do and what not to do. However, Miranda in front of him was obviously not smart to this extent. He could give this girl everything she wanted, but this did not mean that he would tolerate this girl's unrestrained demands. If it wasn't for the fact that he already knew Scarlett Johansson, Miranda would have brought a complete stranger to him this time. As for whether he was being used or not, Eric was too lazy to delve into it, but he didn't intend to let these things continue to develop. Tapping his fingers on the table a few times, Eric looked up at Miranda Kerr. So you probably have no interest in going to school now. Have you thought about what to do in the future? Scarlett Johansson had been paying attention to Eric's expression. When she heard him ask this, she secretly glanced at Miranda beside her. Miranda Kerr also felt the strange emotions on Eric's body. This time, she was very smart and said, Eric, I will do whatever you ask me to do. Chapter 972. Eric thought for a moment and said, if that's the case, then be a model. Go to New York, and I'll let Cindy take care of you personally. Miranda Kerr froze for a moment, and quickly shook her head. Eric, I'm not going to New York. I haven't even graduated from high school. Giselle and Elle both came out to work on their own at the age of 14. You're 2 years older than them. Miranda Kerr finally realized that Eric was trying to send her away. She wasn't stupid, so she easily figured out the reason behind it. She glanced at Scarlett Johansson with some resentment. She got up and walked around the desk, wanting to pounce on Eric and act coquettishly, but she was blocked by Eric. Eric blocked the girl who was about to throw herself into his arms. He hugged her small waist with both hands and gently lifted her up. He placed the girl on the wide desk in front of him and said firmly, or you can go back to Australia to continue your high school. I'll send you back now. Your parents definitely want you to go back to Australia. Miranda Kerr had just kicked off her shoes. She wanted to raise her 2 small feet to tease Eric, so that he would forgive her small mistake today. Hearing Eric say this, she suddenly became nervous. If she really went back to Australia, who knew if Eric would still care about her in the future? She might not even have the chance to live the life she had now. She looked at Eric pitifully for a while. Seeing that he had no intention of relenting, Miranda finally said, Then I'll go to New York. But Eric, what about my parents? Eric held down the girl's small feet that were still scratching his leg and said, You'll have to convince them yourself. If your parents don't agree, I'll have to send you back to Australia. Miranda's parents were soft-hearted people, and Eric didn't believe that this would be an obstacle to the girl in front of him. Miranda Kerr saw that using her parents as a shield didn't work at all. While Eric wasn't paying attention, she jumped off the desk and pounced on him. Like a kitten, she pleaded. Eric, please forgive me this time. I promise that I'll be obedient in the future and won't bring strangers to you. Don't make a fuss. I'll ask May to arrange it for you. You can live with Giselle in New York. Haven't you always liked that house? Eric, I suddenly remembered that you're still using that Citigroup Black Card, right? You might not need it in the future when you're working and earning money. When Miranda Kerr heard this, she immediately stopped pestering him and hurriedly said, No, Eric, I'll listen to you and go to New York. Eric patted the girl's waist and smiled. That's my little baby. Here, put on your shoes. You can go back first. Miranda Kerr slowly put on her shoes and leaned over to peck Eric on the lips before walking out of the door. She didn't even look at Scarlett. Although Miranda was the one who wanted to show off her close relationship with Eric when she came to ask for the role, she naturally put all the blame on Scarlett. Eric watched as Miranda left the office. He picked up the landline and explained to Melanie what had just happened. After that, he looked at Scarlett Johansson, who was sitting across the desk, not knowing what to do. The girl in front of him was about 14 years old. However, compared to Miranda, who was already like a little fairy at 14 years old, the current Scarlett did not have any of the flirtatious looks that she had later on. At the same time, she was also out of the category of Lolita. She was too old to be a child star, but too young to be an adult actress. It was a little awkward. Noticing that Eric took a look at her and started to operate the computer on the table, Scarlett did not know if she should take the initiative to leave. After hesitating for a moment, she did not move and patiently waited for Eric's reaction. After all, judging from what had just happened, the friendship between her and Miranda Kerr could be considered to be completely broken. If she left now, she might not be able to see this Hollywood mogul again. In her mind, she thought of the unattainable aura of this 28-year-old man. Scarlett could not help but sneak a few glances at Eric, who had a focused expression on his face. She was at the age where young girls love to fantasize. After looking at him for a while, she could not help but let her imagination run wild. If only she had such a boyfriend. She seemed to have heard that when Drew was with him, he was even younger than her. He seemed to like little girls. I've looked through it for you. After a while, Eric closed the audition information for Horse Whisperer sent by Fox. Just as he raised his head and opened his mouth, he noticed Scarlett's shy expression and avoided his gaze. He smiled and continued. The age of the character of Grace in Horse Whisperer is 13 years old. Although Kirsten's acting is not bad, she is now too tall. She is almost 170 centimeters. It is not possible for her to act as a 13-year-old girl. Originally, Harvey really wanted Natalie Portman to take on this role. Although she was 1 year older than Kirsten, she was petite and would not have a problem acting as a 13-year-old girl. However, she has Star Wars, the prequel, to be released at the end of the year. Therefore, among the remaining actors, your acting experience and audition results are the best. The chances of you getting this role are very high. Speaking of which, if Eric wanted Scarlett to get this role, he only needed to let Harvey know. However, he did not do so. It was not that he did not want to owe Harvey a favor or anything. When it came to favors, everyone owed each other so that their relationship would be more intimate. The main reason was that Eric did not want to get too involved in this project. An indie film with a production cost of $50 million was too likely to lose money in the future. Mike Mira had just been shackled by the parent company and was not allowed to produce films with a budget of more than $50 million. If Eric casually interfered at this time, if this project failed, it would be hard to guarantee that he would not be blamed. People were always used to taking out their anger on others. Scarlett nodded obediently. It was already far beyond her expectations that Eric would talk to her so much. She did not dare to ask for more. After thinking about it, the girl cleverly found a very interesting topic and said, "Mr. Williams, I heard that you picked up Natalie Portman from the roadside?" Eric nodded and joked, "Something like that. I'm usually used to picking up girls from the roadside. It's the first time I've met someone like you who took the initiative to send herself to me." Scarlett immediately lowered her head in embarrassment and said, Miranda said that you would be very willing to help, so we came together. Mr. Williams, can you not be angry with Miranda?" "Okay." Eric smiled and agreed. He reached out to turn off the computer and got up. "Let's go. I have to go back to work. You can go home and wait for the good news." "Well, thank you, Mr. Williams." Scarlett stood up and followed Eric out of the office. Walking out of the office building, Scarlett Johansson obediently followed Eric. Looking at the studio employees who occasionally passed by respectfully greeting Eric, she could not help but feel a little envy and yearning in her heart. All the way out of the administrative district, Eric stopped at the intersection into the studio area and said to the girl beside him, "Then let's stop here." Do you need me to ask someone to send you home? No, no need. Scarlett Johansson shook her head, her toes stepping on the ground. She hesitated, then raised her face to look at Eric and said, Mr. Williams, can I still see you in the future? Of course, as long as you are still in Hollywood, there will definitely be a chance. I mean, Scarlett's eyes flashed and said, Mr. Williams, I can give you my number. You can call me at any time. Eric was a little surprised. He looked at the girl in front of him and smiled as he took out his mobile phone from his pocket. Here, enter your number. Scarlett did not expect Eric to agree. She excitedly added her home phone number into Eric's contact list and said, Mr. Williams, if I'm not filming, I'm basically at home at night. You can call me at that time. Okay. Eric nodded, took the mobile phone from the girl, and put it back in his pocket. He said, Then goodbye. Goodbye. Scarlett responded. Although she said so, she stepped forward a little. Seeing that Eric did not move, she waved her hand in disappointment and turned to walk towards the exit of the studio. As Firefly Group became more and more powerful in Hollywood, Prevista gradually became prosperous. Scarlett easily called a taxi outside the studio and told the driver to go to Beverly Hills. She leaned back in the chair and recalled everything that had just happened. Occasionally, she would giggle a little. Scarlett Johansson's home was in the residential area near the Los Angeles Country Club at the foot of Beverly Hills. Although it was a wealthy area, it was far from the real nobles who lived halfway up the hills. Scarlett's father, Carl Stan Johansson, was an architect with a decent income. In fact, he was the main economic pillar of the family. Although her mother, Melanie Sloan, had the title of a producer, according to the old saying in Los Angeles, a falling billboard could hit several producers. Melanie Sloan basically rarely received any work. Most of the time, she was just a full-time housewife. As soon as Scarlett entered the door, Melanie Sloan greeted her and asked expectantly, Baby, did you see Eric Williams? Scarlett nodded excitedly. She picked up an apple from the coffee table in the living room and took a bite. She hugged a pillow and sat comfortably on the sofa. She said, I saw him, Mom. Mr. Williams said that I have a good chance of getting this role. Melanie Sloan saw her daughter's excited look. She originally thought that this matter was a success. When she heard her daughter say this, she couldn't help but frown. Scarlett's words sounded formulaic and perfunctory. Scarlett noticed the expression on her mother's face. How could she not know what she was thinking? As a young girl who had begun to pay attention to her privacy, she did not intend to tell her mother the details of what had happened today. However, she still affirmed once again, Don't worry, Mom. Anyway, unless there are any unforeseen circumstances, I have basically gotten the job. Silly girl. Melanie Sloan smiled helplessly and sat down next to her daughter. She said, Tell Mom the details of your meeting with Williams. I'll help you analyze it. I'm not telling you. Scarlett saw her mother continue to ask. She took away the pillow, got up, and ran upstairs to her bedroom. Scarlett walked into her bedroom, locked the door, and rushed to her small bed. She rolled around for a while, raised her head from the pillow, and looked at the small phone on the desk next to her. She didn't know when he would call. She also didn't know what would happen. After thinking for a while, the girl suddenly jumped up again, walked into the bathroom, and posed for a while in front of the dressing mirror. Finally, she took off her clothes and carefully looked at her small body in the mirror. Well, although her figure was far from Miranda's, and she wasn't as tall as her. However, Scarlett was a little proud of her bra. Her breasts were definitely much bigger than that flat-chested girl's. She stayed in her bedroom for a few hours. Remembering that today was the Oscar award ceremony, Scarlett hurried downstairs and turned on the TV. The Oscar red carpet ceremony had begun, but Scarlett wasn't in the mood to be envious of the gorgeous actresses on the red carpet. Instead, she was eagerly waiting for a certain figure to appear. Eric didn't appear. As her father got off work, her sister Vanessa and her twin brother Hunter gradually came home, and the house suddenly became lively. Although Stan Johansson didn't choose to enter Hollywood, because of Scarlett's grandfather and her mother's relatives and friends, the family was basically inextricably linked to Hollywood. Scarlett was originally born in New York, but for the development of their children in Hollywood. The Johnsons moved to Los Angeles a few years ago. Now, except for Scarlett, her brother and sister were all actors in Hollywood. Therefore, looking at the lively Oscar red carpet ceremony on the TV screen, the family's topic naturally couldn't be separated from movies. They naturally began to ask Scarlett about the results of the audition for Horse Whisperer. They all knew that whether or not Scarlett could get this role meant that Scarlett could really gain a foothold in Hollywood without relying on her family's connections. Although their family could have more resources than ordinary people to enter Hollywood, when it came to the level of Horse Whisperer, their connections were basically useless. In the end, they still had to rely on strength and luck. Melanie Sloan didn't tell her husband and the other children that she let her daughter go to Firefly Studios, but when Eric appeared on camera at the end of the red carpet ceremony, everyone's topic couldn't help but turn to Eric. Listening to her father and brothers and sisters talking about all kinds of envious and longing, Scarlett, who had a little secret in her heart, was like a little fox secretly hiding its prey. Her eyes couldn't help but focus on the TV screen, looking forward to Eric's every appearance more. Chapter 973. Although there was not as much attention as Titanic this time, the Academy of Film still spared no effort to celebrate the 70th birthday of the Oscars. For example, after so many years, the Oscars finally had their own theme song. This time, Eric's seat was arranged in the second row on the left side of the aisle. Although there were a few actresses who used to have an ambiguous relationship with him, his female companion was tonight's prize-giving partner, Jodie Foster. Eric had specifically requested this because the women who were still with him did not attend the ceremony for various reasons. As for the others, they had their own lives after such a long time. At least in public, it was not convenient for them to be too intimate. He responded to the guests on the stage and the cameras that swept over from time to time. Occasionally, he would chat with Jodie Foster about Gravity. Time flew by quickly. Eric and Jodie Foster were actually competing for 2 awards, Best Original Screenplay and Best Adapted Screenplay. These 2 awards were usually presented by the same group of guests. Tonight's Best Screenplay award was scheduled for the 5th to last award ceremony. The ceremony started at 6 o'clock and did not start until around 8:30 when the organizer staff came to remind Eric and Jodie Foster that they were about to go on stage. Eric and Jodie Foster went backstage together and took 2 envelopes from the PricewaterhouseCoopers accountant. They waited for the performers on stage to finish singing the episode of Spirit Catcher. Jodie Foster listened to the singing on stage and asked, "Eric, do you think this film can win an award?" "If it is the award we are holding, it is very possible." Eric nodded and said, "Forget about the rest." At this point in the awards ceremony, most of the awards had already been decided. Out of the 9 nominees for Spirit Hunter, Robin Williams had only won the Best Supporting Actor award so far. The rest of the awards were all empty. The English Patient, which Mira Mike had focused on PR, had won 7 awards. The most important awards, Best Director and Best Film, were obviously in the bag for The English Patient. In order to compete with Sony's As Perfect, Mira Mike gave up on Spirit Catcher and focused on PR for The English Patient, which was more popular with the judges. However, Spirit Hunter still had a good chance of winning the Best Screenplay award. This was because if the 2 young scriptwriters, Matt Damon and Ben Affleck, could win an award, even if their influence couldn't be compared to the Best Director and Best Picture awards, it would greatly increase the attention and popularity of Spirit Catcher. All of this could actually be converted into practical benefits. Wayne Stan and his brother's main motive for promoting the Oscars was to gain benefits. Before he could think too much, the performance on the stage was over. With the host's announcement, Eric and Judith walked onto the stage together. Eric and Judith stood in front of Mike. When the applause stopped, Eric cleared his throat and glanced around the audience. He smiled and said, "Hey, I can see your expectant eyes. However, this time it won't be pure gold." There was a burst of laughter from below the stage. A few years ago, when Eric first appeared on the stage as a guest presenter at the Oscars, he had made this joke. Many people in the audience attended the Oscars regularly. Moreover, this year, Eric was promoted to the world's first billionaire. Even if they hadn't seen the Oscars a few years ago, everyone could easily understand this joke. After the laughter, Eric didn't talk about other things and went straight to the point. So, let's see which films are nominated for the Best Original Screenplay award this time. As his voice trailed off, clips from a few films began to play on the big screen. The films nominated for the Best Original Screenplay award are Spirit Catcher, Matt Damon and Ben Affleck; As Perfect, Mark and Drew and James Brooks; Six Naked Pigs, Simon Beaufoy; Deconstructing Harry, Woody Allen; Unruly Night, Paul Thomas Anderson. After the introduction of the films on the big screen, the camera turned back. Eric decisively opened the envelope in his hand, glanced at it, and showed it to Judith Foster next to him. Judith glanced at it, and didn't keep people in suspense. She announced with a smile, "The Oscar will go to Spirit Catcher, Matt Damon and Ben Affleck." In the warm applause, Matt Damon hugged his mother excitedly. He hugged her for a while before getting up. Along the way, he hugged someone else. He was so excited that even Ben, who tried to remain calm, played along awkwardly. The two walked all the way to the stage. Eric was about to hand the golden statuette in his hand to Mada when Dummy gave him a hug. Eric had no choice but to pat Dummy on the back and hand the golden statuette to him. Then he stood with Judith on the side. A pair of good friends walked up to the microphone. Mada was clearly too excited, and he was choking with sobs and giggling. His body swayed in front of the microphone, and only Xiaoben started to give his acceptance speech. Although it's sad that Matt didn't win Best Actor, it's too scary if he really wins it. It's really, really scary. 20 seconds isn't enough to thank all the people we want to thank. So next, we need to thank the director. Dazed Meng, who was grinning and swaying back and forth, finally realized what was going on. But he interjected even more incoherently, "And your brother?" Ben quickly nodded. "Oh, my brother. Colehather. Oh, Colehather. And Mom." The two of them pointed below the stage and said, "It's the two beautiful women sitting over there. My dad is behind. And Boston. Thank you, Boston." Amidst the endless laughter below the stage, the two guys finally finished giving their acceptance speeches at the top of their voices. After the two good friends completely disappeared from the backstage entrance, Eric and Judith walked up to Mike again. With his hands behind his back, Eric looked in the direction the two left in. He sighed with emotion. "Actually, I suddenly want to say that it's good to be young." The laughter below the stage that had just stopped rang out again. However, looking at the calm Eric on the stage, and thinking about the two young boys who had just left, many people were surprised to discover a fact. It turned out that Eric was actually the same age as Matt Damon, who had just left. Both of them were born in 1970, and had just turned 28 this year. Even Ben Affleck was only 2 years younger than Eric. When they realized this, many people couldn't help but sigh with emotion. Although many people gradually realized the strong public relations methods of the Weinstein brothers, Harvey obviously also knew the principle of stopping before going too far. Next was the Best Adapted Screenplay. Although The English Patient was also nominated, it did not win. This award eventually fell to Los Angeles Confidential. As the last two winning screenwriters walked backstage together, Judith looked at Eric with a puzzled expression and asked, "Eric, why do I feel like your emotions just now came from your heart?" Eric did not immediately go back to the stage. He found a seat in the backstage lounge area and sat down. He said to Judith, who sat down with him, "It's from the heart." "But you're only 28 years old," Judith said. She smiled and said, "This really makes a lot of people depressed. I don't think this has anything to do with mental age. You're only, not much. However, you've been acting since you were very young, in front of actors who might be around your age, but who are just starting out. Don't you feel that you're old?" Judith tilted her head slightly and thought carefully. She shook her head and said, "No, I just think of this as a relatively special experience. Is it like the lines in Dark Alley Girl?" When Judith heard Eric mention her movie from more than 20 years ago, she thought for a while and asked with a puzzled smile, "What lines?" Eric just had a flash of inspiration. When he heard Judith's question, he spread his hands and said, I can't remember, but you were really beautiful in that movie. Judith pretended to be vigilant and leaned back. She looked at Eric with a little disdain and said, I was only 13 years old. That's why you people are so despicable. Eric immediately retorted in disdain. Judith rolled her eyes at Eric. She was just joking. She wasn't really angry. During this period of time, she had a deeper understanding of Eric. She felt that this guy was just used to seducing women who were close to him. That's right, seducing. At least Judith felt that there was no better word than this. However, if the woman didn't take the bait, Eric would never force her. Therefore, because of the time they spent together on Gravity, Judith had unknowingly added Eric to her circle of friends. The two joked. Judith listened to the movements in the venue and said, The Best Actress award is coming up. Do you want to go out? Eric shook his head and said, No, I've been sitting outside for more than 2 hours. Let's take a break. How about a bet? I bet that Helen Hunt will be the Best Actress award this time. I don't think it's possible. Helen Hunt has always been a TV actress. The Oscars rarely give an Oscar to a TV actress. What's more, I feel that the other people's qualifications are much better than Helen Hunt's. Judith analyzed her point of view and said, Also, As Perfect as Can is a Sony film. If you want to bet, wouldn't you bet on Mira Mike's The English Patient? You mean Kristen Scott Thomas? Eric said. If I bet on The English Patient, would you still bet? If you bet on Helen Hunt, I won't bet either. Judith smiled and shook her head. I won't fall for your trick. Eric said patiently, It's not good for a woman to follow the rules. Let's take a gamble. Judith thought for a while. Among the 5 nominees for Best Actress, even if Kristen Scott Thomas had the support of the Wayne Stam brothers, Helena Bonham Carter, Judi Dench, and Julie Christie had a higher chance of winning than Helen Hunt. In other words, Helen Hunt had the lowest chance of winning this year's Oscars. Eric saw that Judith was a little tempted and said, The results will be announced soon. Do you want to bet? This is your last chance. Judith made up her mind. She looked at Eric and said, Then tell me first. What are the stakes? They have started introducing the female lead. So, we will talk about the stakes later. It's settled. Oh, who are you betting on? Judith rolled her eyes at Eric and said, Then I'll bet on Kristen Scott Thomas. As soon as the bet was finalized, the music that accompanied the introduction of the nominated female lead ended. The two of them listened carefully. On the other side, last year's Best Actor Oscar winner, Geoffrey Rush, slowly read out a name. The Oscar will belong to The English Patient, Ms. Kristen Scott Thomas. Congratulations. Eric was slightly stunned by the applause, but Judith smiled proudly. Eric, you lost. Tell me, what are you going to lose to me? In the previous battle for Best Actor, Ralph Fiennes of The English Patient had lost to Jack Nicholson of As Perfect as Can. Moreover, this was the 3rd time Jack Nicholson had won the Oscar for Best Actor. As for the nominations, there were countless. Therefore, the fact that Jack Nicholson won the award was completely unexpected to many people. Eric originally thought that the Best Actress award was still very likely to go to Helen Hunt, who had a very low chance of winning. After all, As Perfect as Can had the highest box office sales among all the nominated films. As the only successful film after a year of failure, Sony will not be stingy with their PR fees to help As Perfect as Can win more awards. But the result was obvious. Although Sony had lost the Best Actor award, their PR strategy was still far behind the Wayne and Stam brothers. Therefore, the Best Actress award went back to normal, and Helen Hunt was not as popular as before. Eric smiled when he saw Judith's triumphant expression and said, Well, you can think of a bet yourself. Just don't ask for money. That's too vulgar. Oh, you brat, I really want you to give me a blank check. Sigh, vulgar woman. Of stingy man. Chapter 974. After a few childlike bickering, Eric heard the results of another Best Photography award in the hall, followed by the Best Director and Best Film awards. So he said to Judith, I guess you can't think of any suitable bet tonight. Take your time. We should go outside. Judith Foster nodded. Just as she stood up with Eric, a tall girl walked towards them with a smile from the crowd at the exit of the stage. It was Brooke Xiaoxi, whom Eric had not seen for a long time. She was one of the guests who had just presented the Best Photography Award. "She's here for you. I'll go first." Judith winked at Eric, nodded to Brooke Xiaoxi, and left first. To be honest, Judith's height was close to 160 centimeters. Although she didn't care about this, facing Brooke Xiaoxi, who was 180 centimeters tall and wearing high heels, she still felt a lot of pressure. Therefore, she didn't want to stay any longer. "Good evening, Eric." Brooke Xiaoxi smiled and hugged Eric gently. She then looked at Judith's departing figure and said, "I saw you here, so I came over to say hello. Am I disturbing you?" "Of course not. We were just chatting." Eric shook his head and pointed to the sofa next to him. The two sat down again. Eric was not the kind of person who was too keen on socializing. In addition, the status gap between the two was getting bigger and bigger. After filming Dark War, Eric had not seen Brooke Xiaoxi more than a few times. This encounter wasn't really a coincidence. The reason why Brooke Xiaoxi was the guest of honor for the Best Photography Award tonight was to promote Trump Card 2, which was about to be released in the Easter slot. She was the female lead of Trump Card 2. The core guests of the Academy Awards ceremony were generally the 200 or 300 people sitting in the center. More than half of them were award nominees, and a small number of stars were special guests or award guests. The purpose of these stars appearing at the Academy Awards ceremony was usually not too pure. If you paid a little attention, you would find that they basically all had new films released this year. Brooke Xiaoxi was a typical guest of the latter type. At the end of the day, the Oscars was an economic event full of interests. After Dark War, Brooke Xiaoxi had taken on several movies in a row, and her career had become a little popular. However, her talent was limited after all. In the past few years, her popularity had become lukewarm again. The roles that she could get were mostly for the sake of showing off her sex appeal. Not long ago, when Brooke Xiaoxi went backstage for the award ceremony, she noticed Eric and Judith sitting here and chatting. After the award ceremony, Brooke Xiaoxi noticed that the two of them were still there. She couldn't help but come over and say hello to Eric. However, sitting in front of Eric at this time, although she did not feel any alienation and coldness from this man with an indifferent temperament and a warm smile, Brooke still realized that Eric Williams was no longer the young director who had just made a name for himself in Hollywood. He was already standing at the top of the Hollywood pyramid, overlooking all living beings. Eric admired the exquisite aqua blue evening dress on Brooke Xiaoxi. He felt that she seemed to be at a loss for words for a while, so he thoughtfully took the initiative to find a topic to talk about. "You look very beautiful tonight. Which brand is this dress from?" "Thank you." Eric took the initiative to speak. Brooke Xiaoxi breathed a sigh of relief and said, "This is Givenchy's 1997 Spring-Summer Haute Couture." "Oh, but I don't recognize these." "I don't know how the guests and hosts can recognize the brand of the dress you're wearing at a glance. Is there any trick?" "Yes." Brooke Xiaoxi gradually relaxed. When she heard Eric's question, her expression became a little more playful. She said, "You just have to rehearse the lines with them in advance." Eric was a little speechless, but he understood why the guests of the award ceremony could so smoothly say lines such as, "Your Prada dress is so beautiful." It was obviously an advertisement. Eric's rise in Hollywood was too fast. In addition, he was a director, so he had long left the field of cooperation with well-known brands. Therefore, he did not know the secret until now. Haha. Brooke Xiaoxi chuckled a few times and began to take the initiative to find a topic. She said, "Eric, what were you talking about with Miss Foster just now?" When Eric heard the results of the Best Director award being announced in the hall, he simply gave up on going outside. He spread his hands and said, "We just made a bet and I lost." Brooke Xiaoxi asked curiously, "What are you betting on?" "Since we're here, of course, it's the results of the Oscars." "No, I mean," Brooke Xiaoxi made a random gesture. She was a little guilty, but she still asked, "What's your, bet?" Feeling the girl's curious gaze, Eric's expression changed, and he said, "Do you really want to know?" Brooke Xiaoxi noticed the mischievous smile on Eric's face. Her heart skipped a few beats, but she nodded with some expectation. Eric kept her in suspense, and then spread his hands. The problem is that I forgot to make a bet with Judy. Now I've lost a blank check to her. This was obviously not the answer Brooke Xiaoxi had imagined. However, Eric's answer surprised her even more. Her beautiful eyes widened a lot, and she said with obvious envy, "Wow." In the hall, Anthony Minghella, who won the Best Director award for The English Patient, had already finished his acceptance speech. Eric looked at Brooke Xiaoxi's envious expression and said with a bit of bewitchment, "So the Best Picture award is coming soon. Do you want to bet on it?" Brooke Xiaoxi's eyes lit up, but she was not an outsider who knew nothing about the Oscars. She said, "But the result is obvious now. The greater the risk, the greater the reward. Here, I'm betting that The English Patient will be the best film. Do you want to bet on another film? A blank check?" I rarely make such a promise to anyone. When Brooke Xiaoxi heard that the Best Picture guest had begun to speak, she hesitated for less than 2 seconds before asking, "Eric, what if I lose?" Eric smiled and said, "Of course I want a blank check too. It's fair." "It's not fair at all. Your chances of winning are too high. Do you think the chances of winning with a $5 ticket for $5 million will be the same?" Then, after hesitating for a moment, Brooke Xiaoxi heard that the introduction of the Best Picture award had begun. She nodded decisively and said, "Okay, I'll bet." After this sentence, the award ceremony entered its final moments. Brooke Xiaoxi tilted her head slightly and turned her attention to the hall outside. Eric took a chocolate candy from the plate on the coffee table and leaned back on the sofa in a relaxed manner. Although there are 4 films that will unfortunately fail to be nominated, it is undeniable that they are absolutely excellent films. So, let's see who will be the last lucky one tonight. Francis Ford Coppola's voice faintly sounded. After a pause, his voice sounded again. "The Oscar will belong to The English Patient, Salzans. Congratulations." There was a burst of applause, and the low expectations were shattered in the blink of an eye. Brooke Xiaoxi's eyes flashed. She glanced at Eric, and no one knew what she was thinking. Eric stood up and said, "Come with me." "Ha!" Brooke Xiaoxi was stunned. Is there a need to be so direct? However, before she could tell whether she didn't want to refuse or didn't dare to refuse, Brooke Xiaoxi involuntarily stood up from the sofa and followed Eric out a few steps. She then mustered up her courage and whispered, "Eric, are we going to the Vanity Fair party?" Eric shook his head. "No, I'm tired. I plan to go home early." Countless reporters were waiting outside the Sacred Citizen Auditorium, hoping to interview the winners of tonight's award as soon as possible. It was the most lively moment after the auditorium was over, but Eric didn't join in the fun. He walked out of the auditorium and left with Brooke Xiaoxi in a luxury car. The black Rolls-Royce merged into the not-so-crowded traffic at night in Los Angeles. Eric looked at Brooke Xiaoxi, who was like a little lamb under a ferocious beast, and said with a smile, "Okay, I'm just kidding. I just told the driver to take a detour from the art center. I can drop you off then." Brooke Xiaoxi froze and looked out the window. The Rolls-Royce was driving north, and the venue of tonight's Vanity Fair party, the Beverly Art Center, happened to be there. If Eric planned to go directly back to Malibu, he should be on the Los Angeles Highway 10, which was west. Brooke Xiaoxi thought that Eric wanted to take her home directly. Although she didn't have much resistance in her heart, she still felt very uncomfortable. But now, she was a little worried. "Eric, you don't plan to go home directly, right?" Eric shook his head. "No, I really plan to go home and rest early." Then, Brooke Xiaoxi squeezed the purse in her hand again and said in a low voice, "Then maybe we don't have to take a detour." Half an hour later, at the Sharp Corner Manor, Brooke followed Eric into the Seashell Villa. Under the bright lights, she looked at the ridiculously large circular hall that was like a museum and couldn't help but say, "This place is really big, but Eric took Brooke Xiaoxi to the reception area on the west side of the glass wall and motioned for her to sit down. He walked to the small bar and poured 2 glasses of juice. He handed one to Brooke Xiaoxi and asked, "But what?" "It's too big here, and it's too empty." Brooke Xiaoxi took the juice from Eric and said, "Eric, Don't you feel this way? Eric shook his head. No, I like a spacious place. If the space is too small, I will feel very uncomfortable. Well, this might be a psychological trauma from the past. Brooke Xiaoxi took a sip of juice, but she was curious again. You still have psychological trauma? Well, I think everyone should have some psychological trauma. Don't you? Brooke Xiaoxi thought for a while and seemed to have thought of something, but she just smiled and shook her head. She put down the glass, gently tidied up the dress on her body, looked around, hesitated, and said, Eric, can you find me a set of clothes to change into? I have to return this dress tomorrow. You should be fine wearing my clothes, right? Eric nodded, stood up, and said, Come with me. Brooke Xiaoxi got up, but she noticed that Eric did not go upstairs or downstairs to the other rooms. Instead, he walked to the entrance of the open-air swimming pool in the west. Eric, what are we doing here? After exiting the side door leading to the open-air swimming pool, Brooke Xiaoxi looked around and could not help but walk to the guardrail outside the pool. She leaned on the railing and looked at the dark sea in front of her in the middle of the night. Eric also walked over with Brooke Xiaoxi and said, There are my clothes in the changing room behind. You can pick them yourself. Or, do you want to swim? There are also swimsuits inside. I can also change the water here into warm water. Okay. Brooke Xiaoxi nodded, but she did not leave immediately. She pointed to the low cliff under their feet and said, Eric, aren't you afraid that someone will climb up from here? I'm afraid. And more than once, someone has tried to climb up from here. Eric nodded and said, But they didn't succeed. Why? Eric did not answer immediately. Instead, he pointed down and said, Take a closer look. Brooke Xiaoxi poked her head down, but because of the light, it was dark under her feet. She did not find anything special. Eric also looked down following Brooke Xiaoxi's gaze. He also did not see anything, so he took the initiative to explain. There are alarms and cameras below. If someone approaches here, even if they dive under the sea, they will be quickly discovered. Oh. Brooke Xiaoxi nodded. After listening to Eric's explanation, she did not delve into this issue. This kind of security issue was actually very private. If she asked too much, it would seem that she had ulterior motives. She naturally did not have such thoughts, but she also knew that it was better to take the initiative to avoid arousing suspicion. Then I'm going to change. Eric looked at Brooke Xiaoxi's back as she walked to the changing room, and suddenly remembered a thought from a long time ago. This woman's figure and face were perfect. If she put on a mermaid's tail and put her in the swimming pool, the scene would be very beautiful. Although the nights in Los Angeles in March were not cold, they were definitely not warm either. With these thoughts in mind, Eric also left the railing and walked to the smart console of the swimming pool. He began to adjust the water temperature in the swimming pool. You're tuning in to the Earbook Haven YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.